It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, a couple of friends, and the great outdoors. We'd been planning it for months, picking the perfect weekend, getting all the gear together, and, most importantly, escaping the noise and chaos of our daily lives. No phones, no work emails, just a chance to unplug and recharge. But that weekend turned into something completely different. We drove up to a remote site deep in the mountains, far from any towns or major roads. The kind of place where you could barely get a signal on your phone, and that's exactly what we wanted. We arrived just before dusk, the sun hanging low on the horizon, painting the sky with orange and pink hues. The campground was small, nestled between thick woods and a small creek that ran lazily along one side. We'd picked this spot because it was secluded, peaceful, and offered everything we wanted. A place to hike, fish, and just relax by the fire. We set up our tents quickly, the air still warm but starting to cool as the night approached. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, a scent I always associate with being in the woods. We cracked open a couple of beers and sat around the campfire, chatting and telling stories. As the fire crackled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was a little off. The woods around us were quiet, too quiet. No animals, no rustling in the trees, no sounds of birds. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet you'd expect when you're out in nature. It felt almost unnatural, but I pushed it out of my mind, chalking it up to the time of day and the fact that we were in an isolated area. The first night passed without incident. The air was cool, and I could hear the distant sound of the creek as I lay in my tent, drifting off to sleep. But then something woke me up. It wasn't loud, just a soft, almost imperceptible sound. It was like something was moving around our campsite. I lay there in the dark, listening, but the noise stopped almost as soon as I started paying attention. I didn't want to be that person who freaks out over every little noise in the woods, so I shrugged it off and went back to sleep. The next day, we hiked through the woods. The landscape was stunning. Tall trees stretching up to the sky, rocks covered in moss, and the occasional clearing that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. We spent hours walking, taking pictures, and enjoying the fresh air. But as the day wore on, I began to notice something strange. We hadn't seen a single person all day. There were no other hikers, no signs of anyone else being in the area. It wasn't exactly unusual, but it was odd. The only thing we'd seen were a couple of deer, which wasn't out of the ordinary. As we made our way back to camp, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. A trail of footprints. They weren't animal tracks, but human footprints, leading right into the woods near our campsite. I pointed it out to my friends, but they laughed it off, saying it was probably just someone else who had camped there before us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footprints were fresh, the dirt around them still soft, but there was something off about them. They were bigger than any of us, and they didn't look like they belonged to anyone who was just passing through. That night, the strange feeling came back. As we sat around the fire again, the same eerie quiet settled in around us. No rustling leaves, no animals. Just the crackling of the fire and the occasional whisper of the wind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight. I tried to shake it off, but it was hard to ignore the growing unease in my chest. After a while, we decided to call it a night and head to our tents. The air had grown cold, and the woods around us were darker than usual. I zipped up my tent, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. I kept hearing things outside, soft footsteps, branches snapping, the sound of something moving around. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I realized it wasn't. The sound was too deliberate, too slow. Something was out there. I lay there, frozen, not sure whether I should check outside or stay where I was. The noise stopped for a few minutes, but then I heard it again, closer this time. I slowly unzipped my tent and peeked outside, my heart racing. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the campsite. I couldn't see anything, but I had the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching us. The next morning, we woke up to find something strange. The food we'd left outside, the snacks and water bottles we had set up near the fire, were gone. Not just moved, but completely vanished. There were no signs of animals, no chewed-up wrappers, no animal tracks in the dirt. It was as if someone had come through the camp, taken everything, and left without a trace. We were all a little freaked out, but no one wanted to be the first to suggest that maybe we weren't alone out there. We packed up our stuff and decided to leave the campsite a day early, but as we began to break down the tents, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. A piece of fabric, torn and dirty, was caught in the branches of a tree near our camp. It looked like it had been there for a while. I reached up to pull it down, and when I did, I realized it was part of a jacket that didn't belong to any of us. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the fabric for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. It wasn't like someone had just left it there. It was tangled in the branches, as if someone had been trying to hide it. But why? And who had left it? I quickly told the others, and we all stood around, looking at the piece of fabric, trying to figure out what to do. We didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything in my gut was telling me we needed to leave. Now, we finished packing up as quickly as we could and decided to head back down the trail toward the car. The hike out was longer than I remembered, the woods seeming darker and more oppressive than they had the day before. Every step I took, I felt like I was being watched. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow louder, as if the trees and the rocks were alive, keeping an eye on us. When we finally made it back to the car, I was relieved to see it sitting there, just as we'd left it. We got in, slammed the doors, and started driving down the narrow, winding road that led out of the mountains. The further we got from the campsite, the more I could breathe again. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. We didn't talk much on the way back. Everyone was lost in their thoughts, thinking about what we'd experienced. I don't know what it was that made me feel so uneasy. Maybe it was the strange footprints, or the way the food had disappeared without a trace. Maybe it was the torn jacket in the tree. But whatever it was, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back to that campsite again. As the miles ticked by, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us, but there was nothing. Just the road and the trees stretching out into the distance. We made it back to civilization, and even though I was glad to be home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about that trip. Something that I might never fully understand. I'll never know who or what was out there with us, but I don't think I need to. There are some things better left unexplained, and some places better left alone. I was looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful weekend away from the noise of the city. Just me, a tent, and the woods. I had done this a few times before, but this time it felt different. There was a weird anticipation in the air, something I couldn't quite shake off. Maybe it was because I was going solo this time, no friends, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. I packed my gear into the car late that Friday evening. A tent, sleeping bag, some food, and a few personal items. I had my phone, but I wasn't planning on using it much. I wanted to disconnect from everything. The drive took a few hours, but it wasn't too bad. The sun was setting as I pulled into the parking lot near the trailhead. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered around. I could tell this place was remote, which was exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my backpack and started the hike toward the campsite. The trail was well marked, winding through a dense forest with towering trees on either side. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, so quiet, in fact, that the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel path felt louder than I expected. I couldn't help but think about how still everything was, almost too still. There were no birds chirping, no animals rustling in the underbrush, nothing. It felt like nature was holding its breath. The sun dipped lower as I walked, casting long shadows on the path. I had planned to set up camp before it got dark, but it was already getting close. The trail began to climb slightly, and I could hear the sound of a distant stream. The air had grown cooler as the day transitioned into evening. I finally reached the site after about an hour of hiking. It was a small clearing near the stream, the perfect spot for a campfire. I set up my tent quickly, the quiet only broken by the rustling of the fabric and the occasional splash of water from the stream. Once the tent was set up, I gathered some firewood and built a small fire pit. I wasn't going to cook anything too fancy, just some pre-packed meals I'd brought along. The fire crackled to life, and I sat back on a log, letting the warmth soak into my skin. It was peaceful, at least for a while. The fire danced in the darkness, casting flickering shadows around the clearing. I tried to relax, but that feeling of being watched lingered. It wasn't something I could explain. I checked the area around me, but there was no one in sight, just trees, rocks, and the stream. As the night grew darker, I heard something unusual, a rustling in the woods nearby. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I heard it clear as day. I froze, straining my ears. It was the kind of sound animals make when they move through the brush. But there was something off about it, something that didn't sit right with me. The rustling stopped, then started again. It was too rhythmic, like someone was walking through the forest, trying to be quiet. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself it was just a deer or a raccoon. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something or someone watching me. My heart started to race, and I glanced around again. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker. The fire crackled, popping loudly, and for a moment, I felt like I was being surrounded by the darkness itself. Then, just as quickly as it started, the rustling stopped. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I tried to calm myself down, convincing myself it was nothing. I sat back down and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire. But the quiet stillness of the night seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I decided to go to bed early. Maybe some sleep would clear my head. I climbed into the tent, zipping it shut behind me. I didn't bother with the lantern. The dim light from the fire outside was enough. The ground was a bit hard, but I was too tired to care. I pulled my sleeping bag around me and closed my eyes, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving outside the tent. The unmistakable crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. My heart skipped a beat. It was too dark to see anything through the tent fabric, but I could hear it. Someone or something was out there. The sounds were soft, methodical, like someone was circling my camp. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The noise stopped for a few seconds, then started again, a little closer this time. My mind raced. Should I get up and check? Should I just wait it out? I wasn't sure what to do. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling. I wasn't scared of animals. I'd encountered plenty in the wild before, but there was something unsettling about this. I decided to take a peek. I unzipped the tent just a crack, enough to shine the light outside. There was nothing there, just trees and shadows. The rustling had stopped. I waited a moment, then zipped the tent back up. My pulse was racing. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just hearing things, but it didn't feel like nothing. I lay there in the dark, listening to the night sounds, the distant trickle of the stream, the occasional hoot of an owl, the chirp of insects. But that feeling of being watched never left. It hung in the air like a heavy cloud. I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there, waiting. I grabbed my backpack and pulled out my phone to check the time. It was nearly 2 a.m. I considered packing up and leaving, but I'd already invested so much time into this trip. It felt ridiculous to leave now. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack, like a branch snapping, followed by another rustling noise. It was close, way too close. I sat up, my heart pounding. My mind was racing. What the hell was out there? I grabbed a stick from the fire pit, holding it like a makeshift weapon. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to do with it, but the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. I waited, straining to hear any more sounds. For what felt like hours, nothing happened. It was so quiet, so unnervingly still. Eventually, exhaustion started to take over. I fought it, telling myself I couldn't let my guard down. But my eyelids grew heavy, and soon, I drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up to daylight streaming through the cracks in the tent. I shot up, my heart still pounding. The feeling of unease hadn't gone away, but the night was over. I quickly packed up my gear, making sure I didn't leave anything behind. There was a strange sense of urgency, like I had to get out of there as fast as I could. As I was packing up, I saw something odd on the ground near the edge of the camp. Footprints, large ones. They weren't animal tracks, they were human, and they were fresh. The prints were too large to be from anyone I knew, and they were too close to my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't stick around to investigate. I grabbed my things, hoisted my backpack over my shoulder, and started hiking back down the trail. My eyes were constantly scanning the woods around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still following me, that they were just waiting for me to slip up. I reached the car in record time, my legs aching from the rapid pace I set. I threw my gear in the trunk and slammed the door shut. I drove away from that campsite faster than I'd ever driven before, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror the entire time. By the time I reached the main road, I felt a little more at ease. The oppressive feeling that had hung over me in the woods started to fade. But I couldn't help but wonder, who had been out there, and why had they been watching me? I had no answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that campsite, not ever again. It was supposed to be just a normal weekend camping trip. I had been planning it for weeks, picking the perfect spot up in the mountains, far away from the noise of the city. Just me, the wilderness, and the peace that comes with it. I'd been camping before, countless times in fact, but this time felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something in the air just felt off from the start. I left my house early on Friday morning. The drive was long, but it wasn't much of an issue. I had my car packed with all the camping essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the trusty camping stove. I was looking forward to setting up camp by a small lake that I had read about online. It seemed like the perfect place to get some quiet time away from the chaos of everyday life. The further I drove, the more isolated everything seemed. Trees began to line the road on both sides, and the houses became fewer and fewer. Eventually, even the paved road ended, and I was left with a dirt path that barely seemed wide enough for my car. Still, I pressed on. I had a map, and the GPS had shown me a clear route. The adventure had begun. I reached the spot just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The lake was beautiful, its surface reflecting the deep orange and pink of the sunset. A few trees surrounded the area, providing enough cover without blocking the view. I was alone, which was exactly what I had wanted. I pulled out my camping gear, set up the tent, and built a fire just before the night fully set in. The sound of crackling wood and the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze were the only noises around me. As I sat by the fire, I felt an odd sense of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just a feeling that kept gnawing at the back of my mind. I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the kind of quiet that you don't get to experience often in the city. The fire felt comforting, and I soon lost myself in the warmth, staring into the dancing flames. I had a small dinner, something simple, just canned beans and some crackers, but I didn't mind. It wasn't about the food, it was about the experience. After eating, I cleaned up and crawled into my tent. The temperature had dropped quickly, and I bundled up in my sleeping bag. The wind had picked up slightly, causing the trees to sway and groan. I tried to sleep, but every now and then, I would hear a noise, just a rustle, but it wasn't enough to keep me awake for long. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up quickly, listening for any further sounds. It came from the forest behind my camp. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy for that, too deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent, trying to see what had made the noise. The light from the flashlight barely pierced the darkness, but I could make out the outlines of trees and bushes. There was nothing moving, nothing that could explain the sound. My mind started racing, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I scanned the area once more, then decided it was probably just a branch falling or something else natural. I wasn't far from the forest, so I tried to calm myself and went back into the tent. The wind was stronger now, and I could hear it howling through the trees. My mind kept wandering back to the noise. What could have made it? A large animal? Someone else out here? No, I told myself I was the only one on this side of the lake. I settled back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept racing. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The sun slowly crept up over the horizon, casting a pale light over the camp. The lake was calm now, the water reflecting the early morning sky. I decided I'd take a walk around the lake to clear my head. Maybe the fresh air would help shake off the tension that had built up overnight. I grabbed my backpack, shoved some snacks into it, and left the camp behind. As I walked along the shore of the lake, I couldn't help but notice how eerily quiet everything seemed. No birds singing, no animals moving through the brush, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The forest surrounding the lake felt closed off like it was watching me. I walked for a good while, maybe an hour or so, before I started to feel like I was getting too far from camp. I turned around to head back, but as I walked, I began to notice something strange. There were marks on the trees, scratches that seemed too high to be from anything like a bear. And the closer I got to my camp, the more I started seeing them on almost every tree along the path. They weren't deep, but they were distinct, almost like someone or something had been marking its territory. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I hurried back to the camp. My mind kept jumping to wild ideas. Maybe someone else was out here, someone who didn't want to be found. Maybe they were trying to scare me off, or worse, they had been watching me since I arrived. When I reached the camp, I felt a wave of relief. Everything was where I had left it. Nothing seemed disturbed. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was just being paranoid. It's not like I was in any danger. It was just a few scratches on trees, after all. I spent the rest of the day keeping busy, setting up a more permanent fire, organizing my camp, and getting some water from the lake to refill my bottles. As evening fell, I felt more at ease. The odd feeling from the previous night had faded, and I convinced myself that I was just overthinking everything. That night, I made sure to stay close to the fire. The wind had died down, and there was a stillness in the air that felt oddly calming. I had a hearty meal, cooked over the fire, and relaxed as the warmth spread through me. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that broke the silence. I was starting to feel like I could relax again. But then, right before I was about to go to bed, I heard it, a soft, barely audible crunching sound. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the edge of the firelight. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps, but too deliberate, too slow. I froze, not sure whether to move or stay still. The sound came again, closer this time, and my heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the noise, but there was nothing there. The light flickered for a moment, then illuminated the empty dark trees, but there was no sign of movement. The feeling of being watched washed over me again. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I decided to pack up and leave the next morning. I wasn't about to stick around and find out what was out there. The drive back was long, and my mind raced the entire way. Had I been imagining things? Was I just spooked by being alone in the woods? Maybe it was nothing, but the feeling of unease never left me. Looking back, I know I made the right choice. I didn't want to stay another night, not with the sense that something was out there, something I couldn't explain. The experience left me shaken, but it also reminded me of something important. You can never be too careful when you're out there alone in the wild. And as much as I loved nature and the peace it offered, I knew I would never return to that spot again. It was better to let it be a memory, one that would stay in my mind long after I had left, where it was safe and untouched. It was supposed to be just a simple weekend camping trip. Just me, the woods, and the peaceful sounds of nature. I'd gone camping before, but this time it was supposed to be different. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the stress of work, and the endless distractions that come with modern life. A weekend alone in the wilderness sounded like the perfect way to reset. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the usual essentials. I'd planned on going to a remote spot up in the mountains, far enough from any hiking trails or campsites where I could enjoy some solitude. I knew the area well enough from a few trips I'd done years ago. I checked the weather. It was supposed to be clear skies, no rain. Everything was lined up for a perfect getaway. The morning came and I set off early. The drive was a few hours, winding through narrow roads that eventually disappeared into the trees as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and earth. The occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves made me feel like I was the only one on earth. It was serene, exactly what I needed. I reached the parking area at the base of the trailhead. There were no other cars in sight, and that was exactly what I wanted. I loaded up my backpack, checked my map again, and began the hike. The trail was familiar, though the trees had grown thicker over the years. The path wound up the side of the mountain, steep in parts but nothing too challenging. I passed the occasional rock formation, a trickling stream, and the remnants of an old fire ring from past campers. After about 2 hours, I reached the clearing where I'd set up camp. The spot was perfect, far enough from the trail to avoid any unwanted visitors, but still with a great view of the valley below. There was a small creek nearby which would provide water, and a level patch of ground perfect for pitching my tent. The sound of the water flowing over rocks was calming, almost hypnotic. I took my time setting up camp, making sure everything was in order. I had a small campfire pit, a spot to cook, and a flat area to sleep. Once I had everything set up, I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh mountain air. The peace of the place was almost overwhelming. I could feel the stress of my normal life begin to melt away. The sun was still high, so I decided to take a short walk through the woods to explore. There were no trails to follow, just a natural path created by the occasional animal or old campers, and I felt the excitement of adventure. I moved deeper into the woods, the canopy of trees above blocking out most of the sunlight, leaving everything cool and dim. The quietness was almost too much at times. My footsteps were the only sounds around me, and every now and then, I would hear the distant rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. The deeper I went, the more I felt a strange tension in the air. It wasn't like fear exactly, but something off. Maybe it was the isolation, maybe the sheer size of the forest, but something felt unnerving. I decided to turn back, but as I did, something caught my eye. It was a large, black rock formation sticking out of the earth, covered in moss. I had never seen it before. I could have sworn it wasn't there when I passed earlier. My curiosity got the better of me, so I approached it. It looked out of place, almost deliberately placed in the forest like a piece of an ancient puzzle. I took a few more steps towards it, then stopped. There, nestled into the crevice of the rock, was a wooden carving. It was rough but unmistakable. It looked like a hand, an abstract figure, a hand with elongated fingers that stretched down the rock. It wasn't something you would find in nature. I reached out, touching the carving. It was old, weathered, and the surface was rough against my skin. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. Just an old artifact, I told myself. Still, something in the pit of my stomach told me I shouldn't have touched it. I left the rock and returned to my camp, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. The woods around me now felt different, darker, heavier. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled, like they were being drowned by the thick air. I tried to push the feeling aside. It was probably just my imagination. That night, I built a fire and cooked my dinner. The warmth of the flames and the crackling of the logs did little to ease the tension I felt. I stayed up late, staring into the fire, the shadows around me growing longer. I thought I heard something, a rustle in the trees, faint but distinct. I looked around, but there was nothing there. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought. I went to bed eventually, crawling into my sleeping bag. The night was quiet, except for the occasional wind that rustled through the trees. I tried to sleep, but the unease continued to gnaw at me. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. It was faint at first, just the softest crunch of leaves. I lay still, listening. It was coming closer. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, making their way around my tent. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible, wondering if it was just a deer or some other animal. But the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They weren't like the usual sounds of wildlife. They felt human. My heart raced. I grabbed the flashlight next to my bedroll and shone it through the fabric of the tent. The light bounced off the trees, casting shadows in every direction. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. The silence felt unnatural. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it again, slow, deliberate steps now circling the camp. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no mistaking it now. Someone or something was out there. I gripped the flashlight tightly, ready to defend myself if I had to, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The idea of confronting whoever or whatever it was made my stomach twist with fear. But I also knew that if I didn't act, I might find myself in a much worse situation. The footsteps came closer. The sound of them grew louder until they were right next to my tent. I felt a chill spread through me as the tent fabric pressed in, as if someone was standing just inches away. My pulse pounded in my ears. I didn't know what to do. I could either stay hidden and hope they would leave, or I could make a run for it. I decided to stay still, breathing as quietly as I could. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, just as quickly as they had come, the footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle tensed, but nothing else happened. No more sounds, no more movement. It was like they had disappeared. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept the flashlight close and lay there in silence, listening, waiting for anything. But nothing else came. The night stretched on, cold and quiet. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, moving with an urgency I couldn't explain. The uneasy feeling hadn't left, and I didn't want to spend another minute in that place. I didn't even bother to cook breakfast. I just grabbed my things and started the hike back down the mountain. As I descended, I passed the rock formation again, and I couldn't help but glance at it. The carving was still there, just as it had been the day before. But now it looked different. The hand seemed more defined, more present. I didn't want to touch it again, didn't want to linger any longer. I hurried past, eager to get to the safety of my car. When I reached the parking area, I didn't look back at the woods. I didn't even stop to take a breath. I just got in the car, started the engine, and drove away. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, or maybe it was something more. All I know is that I never went back to that spot. I haven't been camping since then, and I don't plan on it. Some places are better left alone. Some things are better left unexplored. And some feelings are better ignored because once you acknowledge them, they don't go away. They stay with you forever. It was supposed to be just another weekend getaway, one of those trips where you pack light, find a quiet spot, and spend a couple of days just resetting. I had been working too much lately, and the thought of being out in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature, seemed like the perfect way to escape everything. A friend of mine had mentioned a remote camping spot a few hours away from the city, tucked deep in a national forest. I didn't need much, just my tent, a couple of sleeping bags, a little food, and some gear for fishing. I'd done this kind of thing many times before, but I didn't realize that this time would be different. I started my drive early on a Friday morning, the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty highway. The weather was clear with a slight chill in the air, the kind of crisp, fresh air that made you feel like you could breathe deeper. I was looking forward to the solitude. As I drove deeper into the forest, the road became narrower, the trees more dense. The sounds of traffic slowly faded, replaced by the occasional bird call and the rustling of leaves. The spot I was heading for was supposed to be a hidden gem, a quiet, almost forgotten campsite, far enough from the main trails that you wouldn't run into other hikers or campers. The kind of place where you could start a fire and not worry about anyone being too close. The idea of being truly alone out there, away from everyone and everything, was something I was craving. When I arrived, I found a small clearing in the woods. It wasn't much, just enough room for a tent and a campfire. The trees formed a thick canopy above, blocking out most of the sky, and the ground was soft with pine needles and moss. There was a small creek nearby that bubbled along, its sound calming, like nature's own white noise. It felt like the perfect spot to spend the weekend. Setting up my tent didn't take long, and soon enough I had everything ready. The fire pit was easy enough to find, and I spent a little time gathering wood, making sure I had enough for the evening. By the time the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, I was ready to sit down and enjoy a warm meal by the fire. As I sat there eating my food, the quiet of the forest settled around me. The occasional chirp of a cricket, the rustling of leaves in the wind. There was something peaceful about it all. I felt completely alone, but in a way that was comforting, not lonely. The only signs of life around me were the occasional bird that flitted through the trees or the squirrel that darted across the clearing. I thought about going fishing in the creek, but the thought of sitting quietly by the water while the sun set was enough to keep me where I was. The first night was uneventful, just the kind of peaceful sleep you get when you're away from all the noise of daily life. The kind of sleep where you can hear the wind through the trees and the distant sound of the creek, but you don't really mind. When I woke up the next morning, the forest was still shrouded in the cool morning mist, the air fresh and crisp. I made a cup of coffee, watched the fog slowly lift, and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. I spent most of the day wandering around, exploring the area. The forest was thick, but it wasn't hard to find paths that led down to the creek, or up towards a small hill that gave a view of the surrounding woods. I took my time, just breathing it all in, letting my thoughts wander. I could have stayed like that forever. No deadlines, no stress, just the quiet of the forest. By late afternoon, I had gone a little further than I intended. I wasn't lost, but I was far enough from camp that the forest felt a little more unfamiliar. The sun was beginning to set again, and I knew it was time to head back. The light was fading fast, and I didn't want to be wandering around in the dark. The air had cooled considerably, and I had to pull on an extra layer to keep warm. I turned back, heading in the general direction of where I thought my campsite was. That's when I noticed something strange. It wasn't a noise, but the feeling of being watched. I paused, looking around, but there was nothing. The trees were still, the creek still babbling in the distance. I shook my head, chalking it up to the isolation of the place, the natural feeling of unease that sometimes creeps up on you when you're alone in the woods. I kept walking, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my mind. By the time I got back to camp, it was almost completely dark. The fire pit was still where I'd left it, and my tent stood quiet and still in the clearing. The woods around me seemed denser now, the trees looking darker, almost oppressive. The quiet was the same, but somehow it felt different, more intense. I tried to shake off the odd feeling, built up the fire, and sat down to eat again. The crackling of the flames helped ease my nerves a little, but that nagging feeling of being watched stayed with me. It wasn't a real threat, not in any tangible way, but there was something unsettling about it. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but it didn't help. As the night wore on, the forest seemed to grow even quieter, if that was possible. The only sound now was the occasional snap of the firewood as the flames consumed it. I finished my meal and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, waking up every now and then to the same feeling, the sense that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I woke up with a start. There was something moving outside my tent. Not just a rustling, but a distinct, deliberate sound, like someone or something was walking around the camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, completely still, listening. The sound was soft, but it was unmistakable. A footstep, then another, then silence. I held my breath, hoping it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it didn't sound like any animal I had heard before. I waited for what felt like forever, but nothing else happened. Eventually, my mind began to quiet, and I convinced myself it was nothing. I tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I lay awake for the rest of the night, my thoughts racing. It wasn't until the first light of dawn broke through the trees that I finally fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to pack up and head out. I didn't know why I felt so unsettled, but the thought of staying another night didn't sit right with me. I was already starting to feel like I needed to get back to the real world. The forest, once so peaceful and inviting, now felt oppressive and unfamiliar. I packed my things quickly, not wanting to linger any longer than necessary. As I made my way back to the car, the woods seemed to open up a little, the trees less dense. I wasn't as far from the trailhead as I had thought, but the unease I had felt the night before hadn't completely dissipated. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind made me jump, my eyes darting around, expecting to see something or someone I couldn't explain. But there was nothing. The forest was still. When I finally reached the car, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The tension that had been building up over the past day seemed to evaporate the moment I saw the familiar shape of the vehicle. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, the feeling of being watched still lingering in the back of my mind. As I left the woods behind, the tension slowly faded, and I began to relax again. I couldn't explain what had happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation getting to me more than I realized. But there was something about that place, something off about the way the forest had felt the deeper I went. I never went back to that spot, and I don't think I ever will. I'm sure it was just my imagination running wild, but there's a part of me that still wonders if there was something out there, something in those woods that I was never meant to see. I had always been an avid camper, enjoying the peace and quiet of nature. After months of being cooped up in the city, I decided to head out to a remote spot in the woods for a weekend getaway. I wanted nothing more than to disconnect from the noise of everyday life and just be alone with my thoughts. The place I picked was a small campsite deep in the forest, far enough from any trail or highway that you'd be lucky to run into someone. The drive there was long, but the air was crisp, and I could already feel the weight of the world lifting off my shoulders. When I arrived, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a perfect evening. I gathered my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, and some basic survival tools, and made my way to the site. It was a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees, with just enough room to set up a tent. I found a flat spot near a stream, which would make for a nice, peaceful background noise. I set up my tent with ease, something I'd done countless times before. It only took about 20 minutes. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of the rustling trees mixed with the flow of the stream created a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in ages. The thought of being away from technology, away from work, felt almost too good to be true. As the sun dipped lower, I built a small campfire and settled down on a log to cook some food. The flames crackled, sending a warm glow around me. I didn't have much planned for the evening except to eat, relax, and then maybe go for a quick hike in the morning. Felt perfect. I finished eating as the sky turned dark. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks into the night. The air grew cooler, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It was quiet, almost too quiet if you ask me. It was a strange kind of silence, where the usual sounds of the forest felt muffled. It was almost as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I didn't think too much of it, though. I was used to these quiet, still moments. I went inside my tent and laid down in my sleeping bag, the soft rush of the stream and the distant rustling of the trees my only company. The only thing that kept me from falling asleep was the sensation that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but more of a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I tried to shake it off. My mind wandered as I stared at the ceiling of the tent, watching the soft shadows dance in the dim light of the fire outside. The feeling passed after a while, and I finally drifted off to sleep. The next thing I remember is waking up in the middle of the night. My watch said it was about 2:30 a.m., but something had woken me up. The air in the tent was colder now, and I could hear the wind rustling the trees outside, louder than before. For a moment, I lay still, trying to make sense of what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a faint sound. It was coming from outside, just beyond the tent. I froze, straining my ears, trying to figure out what it was. At first, it sounded like a twig snapping underfoot. But then, there was a slight scraping sound, like something heavy was being dragged across the ground. It was slow and deliberate, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I waited, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I didn't move. Maybe it was just an animal. A bear, perhaps, or maybe a raccoon. But there was something about the sound that didn't sit right. The dragging noise felt purposeful, like it was something or someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't succeeding. I cautiously reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to move. The silence stretched out again. I didn't hear anything else for a few minutes, but the unease remained. I told myself I was overthinking it. This was just the woods, and there were bound to be strange sounds. But then the sound came again, this time closer. It was unmistakable now. Something was definitely out there, and it was moving toward my tent. I had no idea what to do. The logical part of me wanted to grab my stuff and leave, but that part of me was also terrified to step out into the pitch-black forest, alone. If it was an animal, I was pretty sure I'd be okay if I stayed in the tent. But if it was something else, well, I didn't want to think about that. The noise was still there, getting closer and closer. I could hear it dragging something heavy, almost like it was pulling something through the dirt. My hand gripped the flashlight so tightly I thought it might slip from my fingers. The light flickered as I held it up to the tent wall, almost daring whatever it was to come closer. Then it stopped. I waited, my breathing shallow, my heart racing. The air was heavy with tension. I didn't know what was worse, the sound or the silence that followed it. A long minute passed, and then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural grunt came from just outside my tent. I couldn't explain why, but it sounded wrong, like the sound of an animal, but also something else. I had to make a decision. Should I stay in the tent, hoping whatever it was would go away, or should I make a run for it? But where would I run to? The nearest road was miles away, and I didn't even know which direction I'd need to go in the dark. The thought of running through the forest in the middle of the night felt absurd and terrifying. The grunt came again, this time followed by the unmistakable sound of something large shifting around outside. There was a scraping noise again, this time much louder, followed by a thud. It was as though whatever it was had knocked something over. I was shaking now, a cold sweat dripping down my back. I didn't know what was out there, but I was sure it wasn't a normal animal. I was starting to think that I wasn't alone out there in the woods. Not in the way I thought. I had no choice. I grabbed my backpack, pulled out a small knife, and made my decision. I needed to leave the tent and move fast. I couldn't just sit there waiting for whatever was out there to find its way in. I slowly unzipped the tent, making as little noise as possible. My body was tense, every muscle ready to spring into action. The flashlight in my hand illuminated the small clearing around me, the trees casting eerie shadows as the wind picked up again. My breath came in short bursts, my feet moving quietly on the forest floor. As I made my way out into the clearing, I stumbled over a tree root, catching myself just in time. I cursed under my breath and continued moving, my eyes darting around in the dark. I knew I had to get far enough away from the campsite so that whatever was there wouldn't follow me. I kept moving through the woods, the cool night air biting at my skin. The only sounds were the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I wasn't sure how far I'd gone, but I couldn't stop now. I had to keep moving. Eventually, I found a small rise in the ground, a kind of natural ridge. I climbed up and crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible. The thought of hiding there until morning seemed like the best option, but as I sat there, listening to the stillness of the night, I realized something strange. I hadn't heard the dragging sound again. The forest had gone quiet once more. I stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting for any sign of movement, but nothing came. The cold began to set in, and I realized that I had to make it back to the campsite. I couldn't stay out here forever. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, I cautiously made my way back to the clearing. The campfire was just a pile of ash, and the tent was still standing, untouched. My heart skipped a beat as I checked the area around it, looking for any signs of disturbance. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its normal quiet. The sound of the stream flowed steadily in the background. The birds were starting to chirp, and the sun was rising. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had gripped me through the night. Whatever it was that had been out there, it was gone now. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't going to stick around and try to figure out what happened. I was just glad to be alive, and I didn't need to come up with any more theories. The woods could keep their secrets. I broke down my tent, packed up my things, and left without looking back. I never went back to that campsite. It wasn't the place that scared me. It was the unknown. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't need to. Sometimes there are things out there that are better left unexplained. I learned that the hard way. The night was cold, and the wind had a sharpness to it, making the leaves rustle in an eerie way. I had always enjoyed camping, but something about this trip felt different. Maybe it was the isolation of the campsite, far from the usual crowd, or the fact that I had come alone this time. But as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest around me seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional distant call of a bird or animal. I tried to push the thought away, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it lingered. I had set up my tent earlier that afternoon, a simple two-person tent that I had used many times before. My gear was scattered around the site: sleeping bag, backpack, a few cans of food. Everything seemed fine, but the longer I sat there, the more I became aware of the silence around me. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence either. It was thick and heavy, like the air itself was waiting for something. I glanced at the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The shadows they cast were long and twisting, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. I couldn't help but imagine what could be lurking in those shadows, even though I knew it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. As the fire burned low, I decided to get into my tent. The wind had picked up, and the night felt even colder now. I zipped up the tent and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake the uncomfortable feeling. The sounds of the forest continued, but it felt like they were getting closer, like the trees were whispering secrets just out of reach. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't easy. The sound of the wind howling through the trees kept me awake, along with the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Every now and then, I would hear something that sounded like footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, but when I checked, there was nothing there. My nerves were starting to fray, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or some other animal. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside, and the sunlight had already begun to filter through the trees. I felt relieved, like the worst of the night had passed. I decided to take a walk through the woods, stretch my legs a bit, and clear my head. I packed a small snack and a bottle of water into my backpack, strapped it on, and left the campsite. The trail was narrow, winding through thick trees and underbrush. The forest here was dense, and I could barely see the sky through the canopy of leaves above. I walked for a while, enjoying the solitude. It was peaceful, and the quiet of the forest seemed almost comforting in the daylight. But the further I walked, the more something felt off again. It wasn't like the previous night. There was no immediate danger, no clear threat. It was just a feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was nearby, watching me from the shadows. I paused several times, turning to look behind me, but saw nothing, just the trees, the rocks, and the underbrush. I continued on, trying to ignore the feeling, until I came across something odd. It was a small clearing, not much bigger than a few yards across, and in the center of it was a pile of rocks. It looked like it had been carefully arranged, not like a natural formation. The rocks were stacked in a way that felt intentional, almost as if they were marking something. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. As I crouched down to inspect the pile, I noticed something strange. Tucked between two of the rocks was a small piece of cloth, frayed at the edges. I picked it up, and it felt odd, almost like fabric that had been weathered by time. I couldn't tell exactly what it was, but there was something unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned it over in my hands, and that's when I saw it. Something carved into the rock beneath the cloth. It was faint, but it looked like a symbol, a sort of jagged pattern that didn't seem like anything I recognized. It wasn't like any typical trail marker, and it certainly wasn't a natural shape. It almost looked like a warning. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the unease grow in the pit of my stomach. I stood up quickly, brushing off the feeling that had crept up on me. I was starting to feel like maybe it was time to leave, but curiosity pushed me to keep exploring. After all, I had come out here to get away from everything, to clear my mind, not to turn back just because of a strange symbol. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, scanning the trees, but everything was still. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily quiet again. I shrugged it off and made my way back toward the trail, but the sense of unease didn't leave me. I reached my campsite by midday, and for the first time in a long while, I felt grateful for the sight of my tent and fire pit. I set down my pack and sat down, trying to push away the feeling of being followed. I glanced around nervously, wondering if I was just imagining things. I had no reason to believe I was in danger, but my instincts told me something wasn't right. I spent the afternoon keeping busy, gathering firewood, checking my gear, and even preparing some food. But as the evening approached and the sun began to dip behind the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in around me. It was like the trees had grown taller and the shadows deeper. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Night fell and I lit the fire again. The crackling flames provided some comfort, but I was still uneasy. I sat there for a while, staring into the fire, listening to the wind, trying to ignore the odd noises that seemed to surround me. It was probably just animals moving through the underbrush, I told myself. There was no need to worry. But then I heard something else, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't a whisper at all. It was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone walking around the campsite. I froze, staring into the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps weren't like animal tracks. They were too heavy, too purposeful. I jumped to my feet, scanning the area, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the shadows and the trees. The wind howled again, but the footsteps, those slow, heavy steps, continued. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, my hands shaking. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. No one was there. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe there was someone out there. But something in the pit of my stomach told me that whatever it wasn't friendly. I backed away from the fire, moving closer to my tent, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I stayed there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening, and hoping whatever it was would leave. Finally, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, and the air seemed to shift. The tension lifted, and I allowed myself to relax just a little. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe I just needed a good night's sleep. But as I crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight on and the zipper halfway open, just in case. I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. The wind had died down again, and the world outside was quiet. My eyes drifted shut, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was still out there. The night passed without incident, and when I woke up in the morning, the campsite was still. There was no sign of anyone or anything strange. I packed up quickly, not wanting to stay in the area any longer. I didn't know if it had been a trick of the mind or if something had really been out there, but either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. As I walked back down the trail to the parking lot, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The woods had their mysteries, but some things were better left unexplored. When I reached my car and drove away, I looked back one last time at the forest, the place where I had felt so uneasy. But I had survived the night, and that was enough for me. I promised myself I would come back, just not alone. The next day, when I got home, I went through my gear, checking for anything I might have missed. It was then that I found something strange. A small stone in the pocket of my jacket. It was smooth, round, and cold to the touch. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but as I held it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the strange events of the night before. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me wonder if I had really been alone in those woods after all. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip. I had planned it for weeks. Just me, some food, my tent, and the quiet wilderness. The kind of escape you crave when life gets too busy. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far enough from the usual crowded campgrounds. There was something about the solitude that made the place feel perfect. It was near a lake, with thick trees surrounding it like walls, keeping the outside world away. I thought I'd have the place to myself, and that was exactly what I wanted. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun still high but starting to dip. It was one of those crisp fall days. The air smelled fresh and clean. The leaves were just starting to turn, and the ground was covered in that golden-orange carpet of fallen leaves. The campgrounds were empty, just the way I liked it. I grabbed my gear and set up camp, not rushing, taking my time, savoring the quiet. The smell of the pine trees filled the air, and I could hear the wind rustling through the branches. It was perfect. After setting up my tent, I decided to explore a little. I wasn't in a hurry, so I wandered down to the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the trees and sky like a mirror. The only sound was the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves. I sat by the water for a while, watching the sun sink lower and lower. As the light faded, the chill in the air grew sharper. I stood up, made my way back to camp, and started a small fire. The fire crackled, and I pulled out some food I had packed. Nothing fancy, just enough to get me through the night. I had a good view of the fire and the lake from where I sat, but there was something about the stillness of the night that felt off. I couldn't place it, but I kept feeling like I was being watched. The sound of the fire popping and crackling was the only noise, and it didn't help the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. I kept telling myself that I was fine. After all, I had done this kind of thing plenty of times before. But as the night wore on, it felt different. I finished my meal and sat there for a while, staring into the fire, the flames flickering and dancing. Then, I noticed something in the distance, just beyond the edge of the trees. A shadow. It was hard to make out, but it looked like movement, like someone walking between the trees. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I hadn't seen anyone when I first arrived, and this area was far enough from any roads or other campsites that it seemed unlikely anyone would be out here at this time of night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. My mind started racing, thinking of all the possible explanations. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or something, but it looked too deliberate, like the movement of a person. I decided to check it out, my curiosity getting the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight, making sure my fire was still going strong before stepping away. I walked quietly, trying not to make any noise, moving in the direction of where I thought I had seen the shadow. The night was cold, the air sharp against my skin, and the forest around me was thick, the trees towering high above, blocking out most of the moonlight. As I walked deeper into the woods, the sound of my boots crunching on the leaves seemed louder than usual. I didn't see anything, no more shadows, no sign of movement. I stopped a few times, listening, trying to pick up any sound that didn't belong. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that almost feels wrong. My breath was coming out in small clouds, and I could feel my heartbeat quicken. I wasn't scared, not exactly, but there was a definite tension creeping up my spine. I decided to head back to camp. When I turned around, the forest felt different. The air was heavier, and the trees, which had seemed so comforting earlier, now looked ominous. The path back didn't seem the same. The way I had come wasn't immediately obvious, and I found myself walking in circles. Every direction I went felt wrong, like I was getting deeper into the forest instead of closer to camp. I stopped, trying to calm myself, but the more I stood there, the more disoriented I became. I turned the flashlight on, scanning the trees around me. It didn't help much. The beam was weak, and it didn't do much to cut through the thick darkness of the woods. My mind raced, trying to figure out where I had gone wrong. I checked my phone for a signal, but there was nothing. I had no map, no compass, just my instincts, and those weren't doing me much good. I tried to retrace my steps, but everything looked the same. The trees, the rocks, the ground. It all felt like a maze that I couldn't escape from. It wasn't long before I realized I was lost. The feeling of dread that had been lurking at the back of my mind was now front and center. I started to panic. I called out, but the sound of my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No one was around. It was just me, the cold, and the overwhelming dark. I walked faster now, hoping to find something familiar, but it only seemed to get worse. Then I heard it, a sound, far off, like footsteps crunching on the leaves. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was so distinct, so real. My first instinct was to run back the way I came, but I had no idea where that was anymore. The footsteps continued, and they sounded closer now. Too close. I felt like I was being followed. I started running, trying to break through the forest, but everything was a blur. My breath was ragged, and I could feel the panic setting in. I had no idea where I was going. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing me whole. And then, just as quickly as it started, the footsteps stopped. I slowed down, my mind racing. I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of it. The silence was deafening. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just an animal, a trick of the wind. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I had to get back to camp. I had to. It felt like hours before I finally stumbled upon a familiar landmark, an old tree that I had passed earlier. From there, it was easy to find my way back to camp. The fire was still burning, and the sight of it was like a lifeline. I collapsed next to it, my heart still racing. The adrenaline was still pumping through me, and I couldn't stop shaking. I stayed up for a while, watching the fire, trying to calm down. My mind kept going over everything that had happened. I kept asking myself if I had imagined the footsteps, if I had just gotten disoriented. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. Something had been out there with me. Someone. Eventually, I fell asleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the trees, made me jump awake. The next morning, the forest seemed quieter than usual, and the unease that had gripped me the night before lingered. I packed up my things quickly, ready to leave. I had planned to stay another night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I walked back to my car, the forest seemed peaceful again, but I knew better. There was something out there, something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to encounter again. I drove home that day with my hands gripping the wheel tight, the landscape passing by in a blur. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? It wasn't until a few weeks later that I heard about a missing hiker. They had been found in the woods not far from where I had camped. They were disoriented, their equipment gone, and no clear explanation for what had happened. The only thing they remembered was a pair of eyes watching them from the trees. It didn't surprise me. I knew that feeling all too well. I never went back to that spot, and I never will. I had always been a fan of camping, the quietness of nature, the feeling of being away from everything, the stars above you with no city lights to block your view. It was a way for me to escape, to breathe, to clear my mind. The weekends were perfect for a short trip out into the woods, so when my friends couldn't make it last minute, I figured I'd go alone. It wasn't the first time I'd been camping by myself, so I wasn't worried, but looking back now, I should have been. I decided on a small, remote campsite I'd found online. It was nestled between two mountain ranges, far away from any real trailheads or busy parks, the kind of place that seemed untouched. I could already imagine the stillness, the peace, the fresh air. I packed my gear: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camping stove, food for a couple of days, and a flashlight. I also made sure to take a good map and a compass just in case. I drove out early in the morning, eager to get to my spot and set up before it got dark. The drive was quiet, with only the sound of tires on gravel roads and the occasional rustle of leaves from the wind. As I drove deeper into the woods, the trees started to get thicker, the shadows longer, and the road narrower. My phone had no signal out here, which I actually preferred. Felt more like a true escape. I found the parking area where I would leave my car and began walking toward the campsite. The trail was only about a mile, but it was steep, winding through thick undergrowth and tall trees. The air was cool and crisp, and there was a faint smell of pine and wet earth. Everything felt perfect. I reached the campsite around noon. It was a small clearing in the woods, surrounded by tall pines and thick brush. I set up my tent quickly, making sure it was secure and nestled between two large trees for a bit of shelter from any wind. I then set up my stove and boiled some water for tea, enjoying the silence around me. I hadn't heard a single person since I left my car. The first night wasn't bad. It got colder than I expected, but nothing I couldn't handle. I built a small fire to keep warm and sat around it for a while, watching the flames dance in the darkness. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The woods felt alive, but in a quiet, peaceful way. I woke up the next morning to a quiet, overcast sky. The clouds hung low in the sky, casting a soft, gray light over the campsite. I could feel the dampness in the air, and the ground was still wet from the previous night's dew. I decided to go for a hike, something to stretch my legs. The trail I was following was narrow and overgrown, with ferns brushing against my legs and branches reaching out from the trees. The forest felt dense, like it was closing in around me. I kept walking, and as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. First, I brushed it off. The woods were wild, after all. There were plenty of animals out here, and I was alone, so of course it felt a little eerie. But as the day wore on, that feeling only got stronger. It wasn't anything I could point to, not a noise or a specific sight. It was just an unsettling sensation, like I was being watched. I decided to head back to camp after a few hours of hiking, figuring I'd been out long enough. The trail seemed longer now, the trees thicker, and the path harder to follow. I knew I had to be close, but everything looked the same. After a few more minutes of walking, I realized that I had no idea where I was anymore. I stopped, looked around, and tried to get my bearings. I pulled out my map and compass, but something didn't feel right. The map wasn't lining up with what I was seeing, and the compass kept spinning wildly. My stomach dropped. I wasn't lost, not exactly, but I couldn't deny that something was wrong. I started walking again, trying to follow what I thought was the right trail. I wasn't panicking yet, but a part of me felt uneasy. The air felt thicker, the woods darker, even though it was still midday. Every step I took seemed to echo, like the forest was closing in around me. I could feel my heart rate picking up. I tried to tell myself that everything was fine, but it was hard to ignore the way the forest felt so empty. There were no birds singing, no animals rustling in the underbrush. It was just quiet, too quiet. After what felt like hours, I found myself standing in front of a small creek. The water was clear, running swiftly over the rocks, and I took a moment to breathe. I wasn't lost, I just needed to follow the creek, right? It would lead me back to camp. I crouched down, took a drink from the creek, and then tried to follow it upstream. But as I walked along the creek, things didn't seem to get any better. The trees were thick on both sides, and the creek wasn't as clear further up. It felt like the forest was pushing me in one direction, making it hard to see beyond the trees. I stopped again, pulling out my map and compass, but neither helped. The compass still spun in circles, and the map just made everything more confusing. I kept walking, my sense of time slipping away. The quiet was deafening, and I started to feel a strange, gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. My mind kept jumping to worst-case scenarios. What if I couldn't find my way back? What if something was wrong with the trail? I wasn't lost, but something told me I wasn't going to get back to camp as easily as I thought. By the time the sun started setting, I realized I had no idea which way to go. The trees looked the same in every direction, and the light was quickly fading. Panic started to set in. I needed to find shelter. I needed to set up camp before it got dark. But there was no clear path, no way out. I made a decision. I would stay put for the night. I didn't have a lot of options. I set up my tent by the creek, trying to calm myself down. The firewood I had was wet from the humidity, and the air was getting colder. I didn't want to think about the fact that I was alone, stuck in the woods with no clear way out. So I focused on my tent, my stove, anything to distract myself. That night was the longest I had ever experienced. The temperature dropped sharply, and the sounds of the forest started to change. I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance, the rustling of leaves. But nothing approached. Nothing was close. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The forest felt like it was moving around me, like there was something out there, something I couldn't see but could definitely feel. I stayed up most of the night, wide awake, listening to every sound. It was torture. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. Every time I thought the noise was just the wind, I'd hear something else. A low rustle, a thud. I couldn't ignore the feeling of being watched. Finally, just before dawn, I managed to fall into an exhausted sleep. When I woke up, the light was dim, but I could see the outline of the trees against the sky. I packed up my things quickly. I wasn't waiting around to find out what was out there in the woods. My instinct was to head back, but I knew I couldn't trust my sense of direction anymore. I walked along the creek again, trying to follow it downstream this time. My steps were quicker now, driven by a sense of urgency I couldn't ignore. The forest felt even more oppressive in the daylight, but eventually, I saw something familiar. The shape of a tree, the incline of the land, it was a sign I was getting close. After what felt like hours, I saw the clearing ahead. My campsite, my car. Relief flooded through me like a wave. I had made it. It wasn't until I was back at my car, breathing deeply and trying to calm my nerves, that I realized how close I had come to truly being lost. How close I was to spending another night in those woods, alone and without a clear way back. I didn't go back to that campsite after that. The woods had taught me a lesson I wouldn't forget. The forest was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. I didn't take my safety for granted anymore, and I made sure to keep a closer eye on my surroundings, even in places that seemed safe. That night was the longest and scariest of my life, but it ended well. I found my way back. It's hard to describe the feeling of waking up in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the sounds of nature around you. I had always loved the outdoors, the camping, hiking, and that peaceful solitude that comes with being far from the hustle of daily life. But this particular camping trip was different. Something about it just felt off from the beginning. I had decided to take a solo trip into the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town, to get away and clear my head. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, some basic gear, and enough food for a few days. The weather had been perfect. Clear skies, a gentle breeze, nothing that would hint at the trouble that would come. The campsite I chose was deep in the forest, far from any marked trails. I figured it would be more peaceful and private that way. It took me longer than expected to get there, the terrain getting rougher as I went. I had to climb over rocks, push through dense underbrush, and cross a small stream before finally reaching a flat area where I could set up camp. The ground was soft, covered in a blanket of pine needles. It smelled fresh, earthy, and clean. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and made my dinner. Nothing fancy, just some canned beans and sausages. As the sun began to dip below the trees, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, and it felt like the world had slowed down. But as the night crept in, the forest grew quieter than usual. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, The only sounds were the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just a wild animal moving around, I told myself. I went to bed early that night. I figured I'd need the rest for the hike the next day. As I lay there in the darkness, wrapped in my sleeping bag, I could hear the wind picking up outside. The trees were swaying gently, their branches creaking under the pressure. Still, it felt safe, comfortable. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I'm not sure why. I wasn't cold or uncomfortable, but something felt wrong. The air was still. No wind, no animal noises, just the eerie silence of the forest at night. I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was just my imagination, the kind of thing that happens when you're alone in the woods at night. But then I heard it, a faint noise, like something moving through the brush. I held my breath, listening intently. It wasn't the usual sounds of small animals. This was something heavier, more deliberate. I lay still for a few moments, waiting. The sound stopped. For a few minutes, there was nothing. But then it came again. This time, it was closer. A slow, steady movement through the trees, just beyond the reach of my campsite. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something or someone was out there. Panic started to set in. I wanted to get up, to check my surroundings, but I knew that would only make me more vulnerable. My heart raced as I lay there, straining my ears. The movement didn't stop. It circled my campsite, getting closer with each passing minute. I considered packing up and leaving. I could do it, I thought. I had everything I needed, and it wasn't like I was miles away from civilization. But the thought of being out there in the dark, walking through the woods with whatever was lurking out there, was terrifying. I decided to stay put. I'd wait until morning, then pack up and leave at first light. The hours dragged on. The silence between the movements felt unbearable, like the world was holding its breath. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. This felt different. The movements were too calculated, too careful. Finally, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the noises stopped. The forest seemed to return to normal, but I wasn't about to let my guard down. I waited for another hour, listening to every rustle, every crack of a branch, before I finally unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The sun had just risen, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I stepped out, cautiously scanning the area around my campsite. There was no sign of anything unusual, no footprints, no broken branches. The forest was quiet again, like nothing had ever happened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was nothing, I thought. Maybe I had just been overreacting. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching me. I spent the rest of the morning packing up my gear and breaking down the campsite. I moved quickly, eager to get out of the woods and back to the safety of the town. But as I was gathering my things, I noticed something strange. A footprint, barely visible in the soft ground near the edge of my campsite. It was large, much bigger than any human footprint I had ever seen. I crouched down to get a closer look. It wasn't just one. There were several leading into the forest, and they were fresh. The dirt around them was still soft, undisturbed. I froze, my stomach tightening. Whoever or whatever had been out there, it wasn't just an animal. Someone or something had been watching me. I quickly finished packing my gear and left the campsite, following the path I had taken the day before. The air felt thick with tension, like something was still out there, just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out and the open fields appeared. The moment I stepped out into the open, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I made it back to my car by mid-morning. The sun was shining now, and the world felt normal again. But I couldn't forget what had happened. The footsteps, the feeling of being watched, it was too real to ignore. I knew I had to be careful next time I ventured into the woods, but at least I was safe now. Looking back, I still don't know who or what was out there in the forest with me that night. Maybe it was a person, someone who had been tracking me. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I'll never know. But one thing is certain. I'll never camp alone in that part of the woods again. That experience changed the way I look at the wilderness. It's beautiful and peaceful, yes, but it can also be unforgiving, and you never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees. So when I camp now, I make sure I'm not alone, and I always stay on the beaten path. Some parts of the wilderness are best left unexplored. The fire crackled softly, sending embers rising into the crisp night air. I sat on the log, wrapped in a thick jacket to ward off the cold, my eyes fixed on the flickering flames. The woods around me were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape. I had always loved camping, the quiet solitude of the wilderness, the smell of pine trees, and the feeling of being far from the noise of the world. But tonight, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense of unease I couldn't quite shake. I had come up to the mountains alone, as I often did, for a weekend getaway. The plan was simple: find a spot, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights by myself to clear my head. I had done this dozens of times before, always enjoying the solitude. But for some reason, this time was different. Earlier that day, I had hiked deep into the woods, following a trail I'd never been on before. It was an old path, overgrown in places, with the faintest hints of previous travelers. I had found a small clearing beside a stream, the perfect spot to set up my tent and build a fire. As evening approached, I made sure to gather enough wood, not wanting to risk being caught without a fire in the dark. Now, as the fire crackled and popped, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. It was a subtle thing, like a shadow lurking just beyond my vision. The woods felt too quiet, too still. The occasional rustle of the wind in the trees wasn't enough to drown out the nagging feeling that something was out of place. I couldn't explain it, but I was certain I wasn't alone. I stood up and walked around the camp, making sure everything was in order. The tent was secured, the fire was well contained, and my gear was neatly arranged nearby. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but the feeling of unease lingered. As I sat back down, I tried to push the thoughts from my mind. Maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, I had been camping alone many times before, and nothing had ever gone wrong. Still, there was something about this place that made me uneasy. The woods felt too dense, the darkness too heavy. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stared into the fire, focusing on the warmth it offered. The flames danced in the wind, their orange glow casting flickering shadows on the trees. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the air, but even it seemed to echo unnaturally in the stillness. I don't know how long I sat there, lost in thought, when I heard it, a sound, faint but distinct. It came from the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't the sound of an animal. It was something else, a soft crunching sound, like someone walking through the leaves. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees around me. The night was thick with shadows, the moonlight barely able to penetrate the canopy of branches above. The noise stopped, but I could feel it, the sensation of being watched. I wasn't alone. I grabbed a stick from the pile of firewood and held it in my hand, not sure what I thought I would do with it. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just a trick of the wind or an animal moving through the brush. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I waited, straining to hear any further sounds. The wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp earth. Still, there was no sign of movement. Maybe I had imagined it, I told myself. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. A soft crunch, this time closer. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone or something was out there. I scanned the dark woods again, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the dense forest and the oppressive silence. My hand tightened around the stick, the wood slick with sweat. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. I had camped in the woods many times before, and nothing had ever happened. but this time felt different. I decided to check the area around my camp. I wasn't gonna sit here like a sitting duck, waiting for something to happen. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and flicked it on, its beam cutting through the darkness. I moved cautiously, stepping over rocks and roots as I ventured away from the firelight. The beam of the flashlight swept over the trees, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I moved further, my heart pounding in my chest, the crunching sound from earlier still echoing in my mind. I tried to tell myself that I was just overreacting, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The woods felt too still, too silent. Even the animals seemed to be holding their breath. As I rounded a large rock, the flashlight flickered. I shook it, hoping it was just a loose connection, but the light cut out completely. Panic surged through me. I was alone in the woods, with no way to see or defend myself. I fumbled in the dark, trying to get the flashlight to work again. My mind raced as I heard the crunching sound again, much closer now. I froze, the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. I could hear something moving in the dark, just out of sight. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something deliberate. My breath came in shallow gasps as I listened, trying to pinpoint the direction of the sound. The crunching stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Too silent. I took a deep breath and began to move back toward my camp. The night air felt colder now, the stillness pressing in on me from all sides. I felt like I was being followed, but when I glanced behind me, there was nothing there. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. There was no one out here, but then I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, something shifted in the shadows. A figure, tall and thin, standing just outside the circle of light. I could barely make it out, but it was there. My heart leaped into my throat as I stood frozen in place. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting, watching. I backed up slowly, my feet crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. The figure remained still, its presence making the air feel thick and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to move. Suddenly, the figure stepped into the firelight. It was a man, or at least it appeared to be. He was tall, with long, disheveled hair and ragged clothes. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and his skin was pale, almost sickly looking. But what really caught my attention were his hands. They were covered in dirt, and his nails were long and broken, as though he hadn't cared for them in years. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching me, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. I felt a wave of dread wash over me, and my instincts screamed at me to run. But I couldn't look away. It was as if I was paralyzed, caught in the grip of something I couldn't understand. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the darkness of the woods without a sound. I stood there for a long time, not knowing what to do. The fire crackled softly, its warmth now feeling like a distant memory. I was alone again, but the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It took me what felt like hours to muster the courage to pack up my things and leave. The figure had been gone for some time, but the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I hurriedly packed my gear, throwing everything into my bag with shaking hands. I didn't care about being neat or organized. I just needed to leave. As I hiked back down the trail, the silence of the woods seemed deafening. Every step I took felt like it echoed through the forest. The crunching sound from earlier had returned, but this time, it wasn't a figment of my imagination. Someone was following me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast I went, the sound of footsteps behind me grew louder. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I threw my bag into the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the dark as I sped down the mountain road, not daring to look back. The woods seemed to close in around me, but when I finally reached the town, I felt a sense of relief. I was safe. The next day, I called the ranger station. They told me there was no record of anyone being in the area recently. No one had seen anyone else out there for days. I never went back to that spot, and I've never camped alone in those woods again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I can still hear the sound of footsteps behind me. I decided to take a break from everything for a while. Work had been exhausting. My phone never stopped ringing, and I couldn't remember the last time I had a quiet moment just to think. I wanted to get away from the noise, away from people, and just be alone somewhere far. So I took a few days off, packed my camping gear, and drove deep into the forest. It wasn't a planned campsite. I didn't want to be around families cooking sausages or groups of kids playing music on Bluetooth speakers. I just wanted trees, dirt, and silence. I spent a few hours studying topographical maps and found a spot near a small lake, surrounded by forest with no trails leading directly to it. It looked perfect. I parked my car as close as I could to the edge of the forest, loaded my backpack with everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, a knife, flashlight, extra batteries, a small first aid kit, and a water filter, and began hiking. The path wasn't marked, and I had to make my own way through the undergrowth. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the lake. It was quiet, still, and beautiful. The water was calm, reflecting the trees that circled it like a wall. I could hear birds in the distance and the occasional rustle of leaves, but nothing else. It was exactly what I needed. I set up my tent near the lake, just far enough from the water to avoid moisture, but close enough to enjoy the view. I laid out my sleeping bag, collected some dry wood, and started a small fire. I didn't plan on cooking anything complicated, just a couple of energy bars and canned food to keep things simple. The sun began to set slowly, painting the sky in orange and red. I sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my face, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. That first night, everything was fine. I stayed up until the fire burned low, then zipped myself into my sleeping bag and listened to the forest sounds outside. There was something calming about it: the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the wind rustling through the trees. I drifted off without trouble. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun was barely up, and there was a thin mist hanging over the lake. I made some instant coffee and sat by the water, just listening. I didn't check my phone. In fact, I turned it off completely before coming. I had a GPS tracker and a satellite beacon in case of emergency, but otherwise I wanted zero connection to the world. I spent the day hiking around the lake, taking pictures and just exploring. I saw a few deer tracks and what I thought were raccoon prints near the edge of the water. I didn't see any people, though. No wrappers, no fire pits, no broken branches. Felt like no one had been here for a very long time. Later that afternoon, I returned to camp. I sat by the fire, ate, and watched the sun go down again. That second night, though, was different. I woke up in the middle of the night for no reason. I didn't hear anything specific, but I just woke up, wide awake. It was pitch dark inside the tent. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and checked my watch. It was just after 2 a.m. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The forest was quieter than before. Too quiet. No crickets, no wind, no distant animal calls. Just silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, stepped out with the flashlight in hand, and looked around. The fire had completely gone out, just some cold ash left in the pit. The air was cold, and the mist was back, thicker than before. My breath made small clouds as I looked toward the lake. Everything looked the same as it had earlier, but something felt off. I don't know how else to describe it. It just felt off. I walked around the camp once, slowly, shining the flashlight in every direction. The trees stood still. No movement, no sounds, nothing out of place, but that feeling of unease wouldn't go away. I went back into the tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. I lay there, eyes open, listening to the silence. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I knew, the sun was up. I stepped out of the tent and stretched. The forest seemed normal again. Birds were chirping, and the mist was burning off. But when I walked down to the lake, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Footprints. Not animal tracks, human ones. They weren't mine. I had been walking around in hiking boots. These were different, barefoot from the look of it. They came from the woods on the other side of the lake, walked up to the edge of the water, and then disappeared. No return tracks, no sign of slipping into the water. Just a single path to the lake and nothing else. I stood there for a long time, staring at those footprints. My first thought was maybe I wasn't alone. Maybe someone else had found the lake. But I didn't hear anything the night before. No sounds of someone approaching, no splashes, no snapping branches. It made no sense. I followed the tracks a little, trying to see where they came from, but the ground quickly turned to grass and moss, and the tracks vanished. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe someone had passed through. Maybe they had seen my campfire and left quietly. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But that uneasy feeling didn't leave me. That day, I stayed close to camp. I kept the fire going most of the time and double-checked all my gear. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed. I had a small folding shovel with me, and I started digging a shallow trench around the tent just in case it rained. I needed something to do. I didn't want to sit still and think. As evening came again, I debated whether to stay another night or pack up early. I had enough supplies for another day, and part of me didn't want to leave just because of some strange footprints. That would be silly, but something in my gut was telling me it might be better to go. I ignored it. I decided I'd spend one last night and head out in the morning. I made sure the fire was strong before I turned in that night. I left the flashlight close to me and didn't bother taking off my boots. I lay in the sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent, trying to stay calm. At some point during the night, I heard it, footsteps. Not animal steps. Slow, deliberate human footsteps. I held my breath and stayed still. The steps moved around the tent. One circle, then another, crunching leaves. I couldn't see anything, and I didn't want to unzip the tent and look. I just stayed frozen, every muscle tense. The footsteps stopped. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. Or maybe it was longer. I don't know. Eventually, I heard them again, this time moving away. I waited a long time before I dared move. When I finally did, I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on. I unzipped the tent slowly and peeked outside. The fire had gone out again, and everything was dark. I stepped out carefully, shining the light around. I didn't see anyone. No shapes, no movement. But the dirt around my tent showed it clearly. Footprints. A full circle of them. That was it. I wasn't staying another minute. I packed everything as fast as I could, not caring about order or neatness. I shoved everything into my backpack, stamped out the last of the embers, and started walking. It was still dark and the forest was thick, but I didn't care. I used the GPS to guide me roughly in the right direction, but I was barely paying attention. I just wanted to get out of there. Took longer than I thought. Hiking in the dark is slow, and the unease didn't leave me. Every sound made me stop. Every twig snapping in the distance made me freeze. I didn't see anyone, though. No lights behind me, no sounds of pursuit. Just the quiet forest and me, hurrying through it. Eventually, the light began to come up. The trees started to thin out, and I saw the road where my car was parked. I've never been so relieved. I threw my pack into the back seat, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before even starting the engine. I drove for hours before stopping at a gas station. I looked like hell. Mud on my pants, circles under my eyes, and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What could I say? That I camped near a lake and someone walked around my tent in the middle of the night? It's been a while since then. I still go camping, but not alone anymore, and never off trail. I stick to public campgrounds now, no matter how noisy or crowded they are. I learned something out there. Some places aren't empty, even if they look like it. You never really know who else might be out there, and sometimes you don't want to find out. The first time I noticed something strange was when I woke up in the middle of the night. I had been staying in the cabin for about a week, trying to escape the noise of city life. The cabin, a small wooden structure tucked away in the woods, was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. It had no electricity or running water, just a fireplace, some basic furniture, and a small kitchen. The outside world felt miles away, and that was exactly what I wanted. But something wasn't right. The cabin was in a remote area, several miles off the nearest paved road. I had rented it from a website, and the description made it seem like a perfect spot for solitude and reflection. There were no neighbors for miles. At first, I thought the isolation would be a welcome change, a chance to clear my head. But now, in the dead of night, I wasn't so sure. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up, suddenly wide awake for no reason. The room was cold, and the faint sound of wind rustling outside made the old cabin creak. I thought I'd heard something else too, like a distant thud, but I brushed it off as nothing. It wasn't uncommon for the cabin to groan and shift during the night. It was old, after all. The wooden beams had been there for decades, and the place had its quirks. I had noticed some of them the first day I arrived, but it didn't bother me at first. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned as if they were reaching out to touch the cabin. It was an eerie sound, but I knew it was just the wind. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. Instead, I found myself staring at the window, where the shadows of the trees outside stretched long across the glass. There was a full moon that night, and the light was almost too bright. I sat up in bed, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the way the trees moved. They were swaying too much, almost like they were shaking. But I knew that wasn't possible, not with just a gust of wind. I stood up and walked over to the window, peering out into the dark woods. The moonlight illuminated the area around the cabin, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the wind. The more I looked, the more uneasy I became. There was a strange feeling in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I stepped back from the window and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the feeling. My instincts were telling me something was wrong, but I didn't know what. I walked over to the fireplace and stoked the embers, hoping the warmth would calm my nerves. But the cabin didn't feel like it had the same charm anymore. The peace I had hoped to find here had been replaced by an unsettling stillness, like the entire place was holding its breath. It wasn't just the wind or the trees, it was something deeper, something in the air. I couldn't explain it, but it was there, and it made my skin crawl. I decided to get out of bed and check the front door, thinking maybe I had left it unlocked or something. The door was heavy, solid wood, with old brass hinges that squeaked whenever you turned the handle. I walked through the small living room, past the worn armchair and the wooden dining table, until I reached the door. When I opened it, the night air hit me hard. It was colder than it had been earlier, and the wind seemed to be picking up again, howling through the trees. I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. The gravel path that led to the cabin was barely visible in the moonlight, and the woods seemed darker than usual. I stood there for a few minutes, just breathing in the cool air and listening to the sounds of the forest. It was then that I heard it, a faint rustling noise coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just an animal moving through the underbrush, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps, but too light and too deliberate. I froze. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of the noise. It wasn't like any animal I knew. The footsteps didn't sound right, too purposeful. I glanced around, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one out here. I was sure of it. I turned back toward the cabin, feeling a cold sweat begin to form on the back of my neck. Something was definitely wrong. I was out in the middle of nowhere, alone, and now I was hearing things that shouldn't be there. I quickly unlocked the door and stepped back inside, bolting it behind me. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just overreacting. The wind was playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The cabin had always felt safe before, but now it felt different, felt watched. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds around me. The wind, the rustling of the trees, the occasional creak of the wood settling. It was all normal, or so I told myself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. The next day, I tried to put it behind me, I spent the day outside, chopping wood for the fire and exploring the area around the cabin. The sun was out, and the woods were peaceful, too peaceful almost. The birds were quiet. The usual sounds of nature seemed muted, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I thought it was just my imagination, and by the time evening rolled around, I convinced myself I was being silly. But that night, it happened again. I woke up suddenly, in the same way I had the night before. The cold, the silence, the feeling of being watched. It was all there. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I got out of bed and walked over to the window again, looking out into the darkness. The moon was still full, casting a silvery glow across the trees. But this time, something was different. There, in the distance, I saw movement. It was too far away to make out clearly, but it looked like a figure moving between the trees, just on the edge of the clearing. I squinted, trying to get a better look, but it was gone before I could focus on it. My heart raced in my chest. That wasn't an animal. It was too tall, too human. I felt a cold rush of fear sweep over me, and I stepped back from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay another night in this place. Whatever it was, I didn't want to stick around to find out. I grabbed my things quickly, my jacket, my keys, my phone, and ran to the door. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I just wanted to leave. But when I opened the door, I froze. There, standing in the doorway, was a person. A tall, thin man, dressed in dark clothes, standing motionless just outside the cabin. His face was obscured by shadow, and he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His presence was suffocating, like he was pulling the life out of the air around him. I was frozen, unable to move or speak. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the woods, blending into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hands still on the door handle. My mind was racing, but my body was paralyzed by fear. After a long time, I finally snapped out of it. I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as if it could protect me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, wide awake, listening for any sound, any movement, but nothing came. The woods were silent again. By morning, I was done. I couldn't stay another minute in that cabin. I packed up everything I could and drove back to the nearest town, my heart still racing, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I never saw the man again, but I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. I've never gone back to that cabin, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. There was something out there in those woods, something that shouldn't have been, and it was waiting for me. I woke up early that morning, the sun not quite up yet, just that pale light creeping in through the cracks in the cabin walls. I always liked getting up before the sun. It felt like I had a moment of peace to myself, a time when everything was still quiet, before the world started to buzz. The cabin was small, tucked away in a remote part of the woods. My plan had been to spend the weekend here, alone, to disconnect and find some peace. The silence outside was always comforting, but there was something else to it as well, something unsettling. Maybe it was just the isolation or the fact that I hadn't really spent much time in this place since I'd bought it. It wasn't much, just a one-room cabin with a small kitchen and a wood stove, but it was mine. The solitude felt like a welcome change at first, but now, as I pulled myself out of bed and rubbed the sleep out of my eyes, I felt a sense of unease. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. It had been a long drive to get here, and I hadn't planned on staying for long, but the quiet had a way of settling in your bones. The cabin sat on a stretch of land far from any real neighbors, the kind of place where you couldn't hear anything except the wind and the occasional animal. The night before had been calm. Too calm, maybe. I'd eaten a simple dinner of canned soup, sat by the fire for a bit, and then gone to bed early. It had felt nice, too nice, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. But now, standing in the dim light of early morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I walked over to the stove and stoked the fire, adding a few more logs. The warmth from the flames spread through the small room, and I stood there for a while, just watching the fire crackle and dance. The cabin was still, the only sound being the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden beams. After a moment, I grabbed my jacket from the hook near the door and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your skin but wasn't unbearable. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs, and began walking toward the edge of the clearing where the trees grew thick. It was still early, and the woods were quiet. No birds yet, no animals moving, just the stillness of nature. I walked for a while, trying to push the unease out of my mind, focusing on the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The woods here were thick, the trees tall and dense, their branches creating a canopy overhead that blocked out much of the sky. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, but I tried to ignore it. It was just the woods. They had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you were at the mercy of something bigger than you. As I walked, I noticed the ground getting softer, the mud more pronounced. I stepped carefully, trying not to slip, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more I noticed something strange. The air had shifted. It wasn't just cold anymore. It had a damp, earthy smell to it, like something had been left out to rot. I glanced around, but there was nothing in sight. No animals, no sounds. It was just wrong. I turned around to head back to the cabin, but that's when I heard it. A soft crack, like something large snapping a branch underfoot. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't know what it was, but the noise came from behind me. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, no sign of anything unusual. I figured it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. They were common around here, though you didn't usually see them during the day. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started walking faster, trying to get back to the cabin, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me. My footsteps seemed louder in the silence of the woods, and I couldn't help but feel like something was following me, keeping pace just behind. I picked up the pace, walking faster, then jogging, my breath coming in short bursts. My feet slipped in the mud, but I didn't care. I just needed to get back to the cabin, to that small, familiar space. I could hear the sound of branches breaking, twigs snapping, now definitely closer. It was like something was following me, moving through the woods just as fast, but staying hidden, just out of sight. Finally, I broke through the tree line, seeing the cabin in the distance. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted toward it. I didn't even stop to close the door behind me as I bolted inside, locking it quickly. I stood there, panting, listening. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, loud and ragged in the quiet of the cabin. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtains just enough to see outside. The clearing was empty, no movement, nothing at all. But that feeling remained, the one that told me I wasn't alone. Something was out there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach. I spent the rest of the day in the cabin, pacing around, looking out the windows, trying to stay busy. Every creak of the wood or rustle outside made me jump. Couldn't relax. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was out there, waiting. As the sun started to set, I knew I couldn't stay here another night. The unease had grown into something more, a gut feeling that I couldn't ignore. I had to leave. I grabbed my things, packed up as quickly as I could, and made my way to the door. But when I opened it, I froze. There, standing in the clearing, was a figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, barely visible in the fading light. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel the presence. It wasn't a person. It was something else. I slammed the door shut, locking it again, my heart pounding in my chest. I stepped back, unsure what to do. Should I stay inside? Should I try to make a run for it? I could still hear the faint crack of branches, the distant sound of something moving, but it was far away now, maybe gone. I grabbed the rifle I had stashed by the door, just in case, and moved back to the window. The figure was gone. The clearing was empty again, but I didn't trust it. Couldn't. I waited, standing by the window, my hands shaking around the rifle. Time passed slowly, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened. Hours later, when the darkness had fully set in, I couldn't stay any longer. The fear was too much. I grabbed what I needed and bolted out of the door, making a break for the car. I didn't look back, not even once, until I was safely inside, the engine roaring to life as I sped away. I didn't look back when I left the cabin behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching, waiting for the next person who dared to enter its domain. And I wasn't going to be that person again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it a month later, never speaking about the strange events that had happened. People could say whatever they wanted. I knew what I felt, what I experienced. But the woods have a way of keeping their secrets, and some things are better left undisturbed. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months. The idea of getting away from everything, leaving behind the noise, the crowds, and just sinking into the quiet of nature was something I craved. The place I had booked was tucked deep in a forest, far away from any neighbors. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, the trees, and the silence. Perfect. I drove up there in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. My car bounced over the dirt road that led to the cabin, the trees around me getting denser as I went further into the woods. When I finally saw the cabin, nestled between towering pines, I felt a rush of excitement. It was a small, rustic cabin, nothing fancy, but that was part of the appeal. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted isolation, simplicity. A small porch with a rocking chair faced the woods, and behind the cabin, there was a small stream that gently gurgled. Perfect. I unloaded my car, bringing in just the essentials. A few books, a flashlight, a lighter, some snacks, and a sleeping bag. I wasn't planning on staying too long, just 2 nights, enough to disconnect and recharge. The inside of the cabin was as I expected. 1 room with a bed, a small kitchenette, a table, and a wood stove for heating. The floors creaked under my feet, but everything seemed solid enough. The windows were covered with old, slightly faded curtains, but the view from them was incredible. The trees stretched out endlessly, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and earth. I settled in quickly, lighting a fire in the stove. It crackled to life, filling the room with warmth. The night was coming, and the temperature was dropping quickly. I made myself some tea, then sat in the rocking chair outside on the porch. The sun set slowly, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The only sounds were the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and the occasional call of a distant bird. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. As darkness fell, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The night was quiet, and the forest was still. I kept the fire going, not wanting the cold to creep in. I sat in the chair by the fire, reading my book, but something felt off. The silence in the cabin seemed to be pressing in on me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just me and the woods. There was no one else around for miles. As the night stretched on, I felt the unease grow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I would hear a twig snap outside, or the sound of something brushing against the side of the cabin. But when I would look out the window or step outside, nothing was there. The forest was as still as ever. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. The fire was starting to die down, and the temperature in the cabin was dropping. I pulled the covers up, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees. It sounded like it was getting closer, the wind rattling the cabin's walls and making the windows shake. Every gust of wind made the trees groan, like they were whispering secrets to each other. I tossed and turned, the unease refusing to leave. I kept imagining strange shapes moving outside, shadows in the corner of my eyes. I would sit up, heart pounding, but when I looked around, nothing was there. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up suddenly to the sound of something heavy moving outside. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. The noise wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the creaking of branches. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was outside. My mind raced, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a bear or a deer. But no, the steps were too loud, too human. I lay there in the dark, my body tense, listening intently. The noise continued, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. It was like whoever or whatever was out there was pacing, circling the cabin. I could hear the occasional scratch of nails against the wooden walls, like someone was dragging their hand along the cabin's sides. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was probably an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed the flashlight from the table beside the bed and slowly crept to the window, trying to peer through the curtains. My breath caught when I saw a dark figure standing just outside. It was tall, too tall to be a bear or a deer. It was human-shaped, but the way it stood was unnatural. It was motionless, staring into the cabin. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. I couldn't see its face clearly, but the figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting, watching. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The figure didn't move. I wanted to grab my things and run, but I knew the woods were dangerous at night. The best option was to stay inside, keep quiet, and hope whatever it was lost interest. I sat in the corner of the cabin, flashlight in hand, and waited. The silence was deafening, and every time the wind blew or a branch cracked, I jumped. Around 2 a.m., the noises stopped. The figure outside disappeared. I was left in the quiet of the cabin, unsure if it had really been there or if I had imagined it. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. By morning, the sun had risen, and the forest was once again peaceful. I stepped outside tentatively, my heart still racing from the events of the night before. There was no sign of anyone. The ground was still, undisturbed. I checked around the cabin, but nothing seemed out of place. The trees were just trees. The birds were chirping, and the only thing that seemed unusual was the lingering sense of dread I couldn't shake. I spent the rest of the day inside, only venturing out to gather firewood. I kept the doors locked and the windows closed, constantly feeling like someone was watching me from the trees. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind made me jump. I had never been more aware of the forest around me, the stillness that felt like it was closing in on me. That night, I made the decision to leave. The peace I had come to find in nature had turned into a suffocating, claustrophobic fear. I didn't know who or what had been outside my cabin the night before, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. Packing up my things quickly, I grabbed my car keys and headed out. The forest was dark and silent, the trees like black sentinels lining the road. I drove fast, my headlights cutting through the darkness, my heart still pounding in my chest. The road felt endless, the trees pressing in on either side, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. By the time I reached the main road, the sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. I was shaken, but I was safe. I had no explanation for what had happened. There was no logical reason for a person to be out there in the woods at night, in the middle of nowhere, just standing outside my cabin. I never found out who or what it was, but I never went back to that cabin again. The woods had taken on a new meaning for me now. What I once thought was peaceful and serene was now a place of mystery and fear. I had gone looking for solitude, but I had found something else entirely. The forest had secrets, and I wasn't meant to know them. And sometimes, it's better to leave those secrets untouched. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into when I decided to rent a small cabin for a weekend getaway. It wasn't far from civilization, but it felt like it was. The road that led to it was long and winding, cutting through dense woods that seemed like they had never been touched by human hands. The GPS told me I was close, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw when I pulled up to the cabin. It looked older than the pictures had suggested. The wood was worn, with the paint peeling off in patches, the roof slightly sagging in the middle as though time had been taking its toll. It was one of those old, rustic places that had character, but it also had a history that I wasn't yet sure I wanted to learn. I had hoped for a peaceful weekend to clear my head, to escape the noise of everyday life. But the moment I set foot on the porch, something didn't sit right. I opened the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood, dust, and something a bit mustier filled the air. The cabin was small but cozy. The furniture looked old but comfortable enough. A fireplace stood at one end of the room, and a window on the far wall let in soft, natural light. I set my bags down and walked around, taking in the details. The cabin had charm, sure, but it felt empty, in a way that made me uneasy, like it was waiting for something. I didn't let myself get too caught up in the odd feeling I was having. I had a book and a bottle of wine, and the weekend was all about unwinding. I went to the kitchen to grab a glass, and that's when I noticed it. The strange scratch marks on the floor. They weren't deep, but they were noticeable enough, like something or someone had dragged across the wood. I knelt down to get a better look. The marks led toward the back of the cabin, toward the bedroom, but stopped just before reaching it. I told myself it was nothing, just an old place with some wear and tear. I didn't want to dwell on it. The last thing I needed was to work myself up over nothing. So I made my wine, curled up on the couch and read for a few hours. But as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the uneasy feeling crept back in. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that made every creak and groan of the old building seem 10 times louder. I could hear the wind rustling outside, but there was something else in the air, something off. I went to bed later that night trying to shake the feeling. The bed was uncomfortable, but I managed to fall asleep eventually. I awoke to a sound. It was soft at first, a faint scratching noise, like someone running their nails across the walls. My heart raced as I lay in the dark, listening. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the noise kept coming soft and steady. It felt like it was getting closer, but there was no logical reason for it. The walls of the cabin were thick, the windows tightly shut. Nothing could be making that noise. I wanted to get up and investigate, but the thought of getting out of bed, of facing whatever was causing the sound, made me freeze. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the sun had risen, but it didn't feel any better. The silence was still too much. I got up, made some coffee, and went outside to clear my head. The air was cold, but refreshing, and for a moment, I felt like everything would be fine. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the calm, the peace of being away from everything. That's when I noticed the marks again. They were outside this time, the same scratches I had seen inside, but now they were on the porch, leading down the steps and into the woods. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at them. The same pattern, the same randomness, but this time, the marks were fresher, as though someone or something had walked across the porch just that morning. I don't know why, but I decided to follow them. Something about the marks pulled me in like a puzzle I had to solve. I didn't think about the fact that it was stupid or dangerous. I just walked, letting the scratches guide me deeper into the woods. The trail was faint but clear enough to follow, cutting through the underbrush and winding around trees. I walked for what felt like an hour, my mind racing. What could have made these marks? Why were they leading me deeper into the forest? Every step I took, I felt more exposed, more vulnerable. But still, I pressed on. The further I went, the less I saw. The trees grew denser, blocking out the light, and the path became harder to follow. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every part of me told me to turn back. But something, maybe curiosity, maybe fear, kept me going. The scratches led to a clearing, and in the middle of it stood an old, decaying shed. It was almost completely hidden by overgrown vines and trees, but there it was. I stared at it for a long time, not sure what to do next. The shed looked abandoned, its wooden walls warped and sagging. The roof was caved in places, and the door was half hanging off its hinges. There was no reason for me to go inside, no reason to investigate further. But I had to know. I pushed the door open, the wood creaking loudly as it gave way. The inside of the shed was dark and musty. There was nothing of value inside, just old furniture, piles of rotting wood, and dust. But something about it felt wrong. The air felt thicker, as if something had been trapped inside for a long time. I walked in cautiously, my feet crunching on the debris beneath me. That's when I saw it. A small box, tucked away in the corner. It looked out of place, new and untouched, despite everything else in the shed being covered in decay. My hands shook as I reached for it. It wasn't locked, but it was heavier than I expected. I opened it slowly, the hinges squeaking as they gave way. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in old cloth. I unwrapped it carefully. Inside, there were old, faded photographs. Most of them were too blurry to make out, but one stood out. A picture of the cabin, taken from a distance. The photo was old, but the cabin looked almost the same as it did now. It was surrounded by the same trees, the same setting. But what caught my eye were the people standing in front of it. There were two men, both with dark expressions, standing just outside the door, looking directly at the camera. I didn't recognize them, but something about their gaze sent a chill down my spine. I set the photo down, my mind racing. Was this a coincidence? Why was it here? I turned to leave, but as I did, I heard it again. The scratching. It was coming from inside the shed this time. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one else around, no animal that could have made that noise. My heart raced as I backed toward the door, but the scratching grew louder, more frantic. I didn't wait to see what was making the sound. I ran. I didn't look back until I was safely back inside the cabin. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I bolted it shut. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched never left. The evening came, and with it, more silence. But it was a different kind of silence. It felt heavier now, like something was lingering just beyond the edges of my vision. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I packed up and left, my nerves on edge as I drove away from the cabin. I didn't care if I didn't finish my weekend getaway. I just needed to leave. As I drove away, I glanced at the cabin one last time in my rearview mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window. I didn't stop to find out. When I got home, I looked up the history of the cabin. The place had been built in the early 1900s, and there had been reports of strange occurrences surrounding it. People who had stayed there over the years mentioned odd sounds, sightings, and unexplained events. I couldn't find any information about the two men in the photo, but I didn't need to. I never went back to that cabin. I was supposed to be there for just a weekend. Nothing too complicated, just a quick getaway. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense forest, and that was the whole point. A place to unplug and get some peace. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. The last stretch was bumpy, and the tires of my car kicked up little clouds of dust as I made my way toward the cabin. At first, I didn't notice anything odd. The place looked pretty much like you'd expect. A small wooden cabin with a wraparound porch, a stone chimney poking out of the roof, and a few trees around it, their branches heavy with leaves. It seemed like a peaceful retreat. The cabin was empty when I stepped inside, save for the dusty furniture and the musty smell of wood that had been sitting unused for too long. A single lamp on the far wall was the only thing lighting the place, casting a soft glow on the dark wood panels. There was no one else around. No neighbors, no sound of traffic, no hustle. Just quiet. I set my bag on the couch and walked over to the small kitchen. A pot sat on the stove, but the smell of old and used metal made my stomach churn a little. It didn't look like anyone had used the cabin recently, though everything seemed well kept. I decided I'd stay for the night. No need to get too worked up over a little dust and silence. The first night was uneventful. I made some food, ate, and settled in by the fireplace. It was cold out, and the warmth from the fire made the cabin feel like home. I couldn't have asked for a more relaxing evening. But as I settled into bed later that night, something felt off. The bed was comfortable enough, and I thought I'd sleep soundly. But around midnight, I woke up with a start. I couldn't explain why, but I had a sense that something wasn't right. The wind had picked up outside, and the branches of the trees scraped against the windows. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes again, but there was a feeling in the air. Something thick, almost suffocating. I thought about getting up, maybe checking out the windows, but I stayed put, trying to reassure myself that I was being paranoid. After all, it was just the wind, right? Still, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that I was being watched. I eventually fell back into a restless sleep. The next morning, the sky was overcast, and the air felt colder than before. I made breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, feeling more on edge than I had the night before. The quiet of the cabin was starting to get to me, and it was almost unnerving how still the forest seemed. There was no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just an unsettling calm. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, making my way toward the wooded area behind the cabin. The forest was thick, the trees towering over me, their trunks covered in moss. It felt like I was walking through a painting, the shadows from the clouds above stretching long across the ground. But after a while, I began to notice something strange. The path I was following seemed to curve unnaturally, like it was taking me deeper into the woods. At first, I figured it was just my mind playing tricks. The path twisted and turned, but that's how trails worked in forests, right? But the deeper I walked, the more isolated I felt. I had no idea how far I'd gone, but the cabin was no longer visible. And the trees, they felt different now. Their branches loomed over me like dark, watching hands. I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting someone or something to be following me. I tried to turn around, but the path I'd taken seemed to have changed. The trees blocked my way, and I could no longer see the familiar landmarks I had passed. Panic started to creep into my chest, tightening with every step I took. The silence was deafening. I felt lost, alone. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and it was hard to tell how much time had passed. I stumbled, tripping over a root, and that's when I saw it. A small, weathered building, almost hidden by the overgrowth. It wasn't the cabin. This was different. A shack of some kind, barely standing. Its roof was sagging, and the wood was gray with age, cracked and splintered in places. I couldn't explain why, but it gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. Something about it didn't feel right. Against my better judgment, I approached it, my heart pounding. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, I saw nothing but darkness. The air around the shack was heavier, like the trees themselves were pressing in on me. A strange smell, like old earth and rotting wood, drifted out. I stepped back, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, to leave this place behind. But then I noticed something else. In the dirt near the doorway, there were fresh tracks. Not animal tracks, human tracks. They were too recent to be from anyone else but the person who had been here, and the thought made my stomach lurch. I looked around, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine, but there was no one in sight. I turned quickly, my feet carrying me back toward the path, but I couldn't shake the image of the shack from my mind. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it lingered. I kept walking, but the further I went, the more I realized I wasn't sure where I was. I'd walked too far, lost my sense of direction, and now the woods were beginning to feel claustrophobic. The trees pressed in closer, and the air grew thick and heavy. By the time I found the trail back to the cabin, I was shaken. My heart was racing, and I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I half expected someone to be there, following me, but no one was. The cabin looked the same when I returned. Quiet, still as if nothing had happened. I didn't stay outside much after that. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like a maze, and the air had changed somehow. The silence weighed down on me, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I locked the door that night, something I hadn't done the night before, and pulled the curtains tight. The hours stretched on in the cabin, and the unsettling feeling from earlier never fully faded. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts kept returning to that shack in the woods, the way it felt wrong, like it was hiding something. What was it doing out here so far from the cabin? The next morning, the silence was even more oppressive. I woke early, packed up my things, and left before the sun had fully risen. I didn't want to stay another minute in that place. As I drove away, the trees loomed behind me, their branches casting long shadows across the road. But I didn't look back. Couldn't. I don't know what I saw out there, and I don't know what I disturbed, but I do know one thing. Some places are meant to stay forgotten. The shack in the woods. Whatever it was, I'm not sure I want to know, but I do know I won't be going back there again. The wind howled through the trees as I made my way up the narrow, winding dirt road, the headlights of my car casting long, eerie shadows along the edges of the forest. It was late, around midnight, and I had been driving for hours, far past the point where any signs of civilization had disappeared. The cabin I rented was supposed to be a secluded getaway, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of city life. I had no intention of staying in a crowded hotel, so when I found the listing for a small, isolated cabin in the woods, I thought it would be perfect. I wasn't scared. At least, I didn't think I would be. The idea of spending a weekend in a remote cabin, far from the noise and distractions of modern life, was exactly what I needed. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat, a place to relax and recharge. But as I drove deeper into the woods, the silence around me started to feel oppressive, almost suffocating. The trees were thick here, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking out most of the moonlight. I tried to shake off the unease that crept up on me, focusing on the road ahead. Eventually, I turned a sharp corner, and there it was, the cabin. The headlights of my car illuminated its weathered, wooden exterior, casting long shadows that made it seem almost ancient. The roof was sagging in places, and the porch had a noticeable dip in the middle. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but the listing had mentioned it was recently renovated. I pulled into the gravel driveway, parked my car, and stepped out into the cold night air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled my lungs as I grabbed my bags from the trunk. The cabin was small, a one-story building with a stone chimney and a single front door. A set of worn wooden steps led up to the porch, and a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a faint yellow glow over the front. It looked peaceful enough, though the sagging roof and peeling paint gave it a certain charm, if you could call it that. I pulled my bags inside, closing the door behind me. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly cozy. The main room had a stone fireplace at one end, with a few old chairs scattered around a rough-hewn wooden table. The floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored further, my boots echoing through the empty space. The small kitchen was to my right, with a narrow hallway leading to what I assumed were the bedroom and bathroom. I unpacked my things, setting my bag down on the bed in the back room and then starting a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound of the wood burning was soothing, a stark contrast to the silence outside. I turned on the radio for some background noise, but it was static-laden, nothing but a faint buzz that did little to fill the space. I flicked it off, deciding to embrace the quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept fitfully, but that was to be expected. It wasn't uncommon for me to have trouble adjusting to new places. I woke up early the next morning to the sound of birds calling out in the trees. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the forest. I made coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the woods around me. The cabin was even more isolated than I had expected. There was no sign of anyone else for miles in any direction. It felt peaceful, almost serene, despite the lingering unease I couldn't quite shake. I decided to go for a hike that morning, to explore the area and get some fresh air. I grabbed my jacket, laced up my boots, and headed out the door. The woods were dense, with thick underbrush and towering trees that blocked out most of the light. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the forest, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles on the ground. It was quiet here, too quiet. No animals, no rustling in the trees, just the occasional creak of the branches swaying in the wind. As I walked further, the trail started to narrow. I glanced back occasionally, but the cabin was already hidden from view behind the thick trees. I wasn't concerned, just a little unsettled. There was something about this place, something about the stillness of the forest, that made me uneasy. I pushed the feeling aside, telling myself it was just the isolation. After a few hours of walking, I turned around and headed back to the cabin. The sunlight was starting to fade, and the woods seemed even quieter than before. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door, which I had left shut tight when I left, was slightly ajar. My heart skipped a beat as I approached cautiously. The door wasn't wide open, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I didn't remember leaving it that way, but I chalked it up to me being distracted or forgetful. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way when I left. I stepped inside, and everything seemed normal at first. My bags were still in the same spot, and the fire had burned down to embers. But there was a strange, musty smell in the air, like something had been left out too long. I walked through the cabin, checking each room, but there was nothing obviously out of place. Still, the feeling of unease wouldn't leave. That night, the wind picked up. The trees outside creaked and groaned in the breeze, and the occasional thud echoed through the cabin, like something was hitting the side of the building. It was probably just a branch or a loose shutter, but the sound was unsettling in the dead of night. I stayed by the fire, my eyes flicking to the windows every so often, expecting to see something or someone standing outside. But there was nothing, just darkness. As the night wore on, I started to hear footsteps. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the house settling. But then the footsteps grew louder, as though someone was walking around the cabin. I stood up, heart pounding in my chest, and moved toward the door. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood by the door for what felt like hours, my hand resting on the knob, ready to throw it open if necessary. But the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started, and the night was once again still. I waited, listening intently, but nothing happened. Eventually, I closed the door and locked it, then slid a heavy chair in front of it, just in case. I was being paranoid, I told myself, just tired from the isolation. The next morning, I was determined to push past whatever it was that was bothering me. I went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. There were no signs of anyone being around, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing that indicated someone had been there. I even checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. But despite all of this, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That evening, as the sun set and the forest grew darker, I heard the footsteps again. They were faint at first, just like before, but this time they seemed to be coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. I knew I was alone. I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day. I stood up, gripping the arm of the chair as I listened, straining to hear any sound that might explain what was happening. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. It was just a shadow at first, darting across the room like a quick, fleeting thought. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned to face it, but the room was empty. I ran to the door and yanked it open. The cold night air hit me hard, but I didn't care. I bolted out of the cabin, moving quickly into the woods. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away, to escape the oppressive silence that had been suffocating me. I stumbled through the trees, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I must have run for miles, but eventually, I stopped, unable to go any further. My legs were shaking, and my mind was spinning. I turned back, realizing how far I had gotten from the cabin. It felt like a lifetime since I had left. I started walking back, trying to calm myself down. When I returned, the cabin was just as I had left it, empty and still. There was no sign of anyone, no evidence that anything had happened. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe it had all been a product of my own fear. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since I arrived. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I couldn't shake the feeling of relief as I drove away from the cabin, the dense forest slowly fading into the distance behind me. I never went back, and as the years passed, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I had just let the isolation get to me, but deep down, I knew that something had been wrong with that place, something I couldn't explain. I didn't want to know what it was, and I was just glad I never had to find out. The night was settling in as I drove deeper into the woods. I had been planning this trip for a while, a weekend away from the hustle of city life. The cabin I had rented was secluded, a tiny, weather-beaten structure tucked far from any signs of civilization. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, just me and the woods. I had always liked the idea of being alone in nature. I had read up on the area, made sure it was safe. The cabin was a small, old building made of timber, with a porch and a fireplace. The owner had warned me that the place was a little out of the way, but I didn't mind. In fact, that was the appeal. No one would be around for miles, just the silence and the forest. The road leading to the cabin was narrow and winding. As I drove, the trees seemed to grow closer together, blocking out the fading light from the sky. The last rays of the sun barely pierced through the thick canopy above. By the time I reached the cabin, it was almost completely dark. I pulled up to the small clearing, parked the car, and grabbed my bags. The air felt cool, even for late summer, and there was an odd stillness in the woods. No crickets, no wind, just quiet. I walked up to the front door and unlocked it. The key was a rusty thing, like it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and pine. The furniture was basic but functional. An old couch, a small table, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a fireplace against one wall, and a large window that overlooked the forest. I unpacked my things and started a fire in the hearth. The crackling sound of the flames was oddly soothing. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple dinner, and spent a few hours reading. The wind picked up outside, but it wasn't anything alarming. I didn't mind the sounds of the trees shifting in the breeze, or the occasional creak of the cabin. I slept soundly, wrapped up in blankets, with the fire still flickering softly in the fireplace. The next morning, I woke early, the sunlight filtering through the windows in pale shafts of gold. I stepped outside onto the porch and inhaled deeply. The air was fresh, crisp with the smell of pine and earth. There was something oddly peaceful about it, but also unsettling in a way I couldn't quite place. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, no signs of other human life for miles. I decided to go for a walk, just to explore the area a bit. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional bird call. The trees were massive here, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. As I walked further, the ground beneath my boots turned soft and spongy, as if the forest floor had absorbed years of rain. The path wound through dense undergrowth, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches a few times. I wasn't sure how far I had gone, but it didn't matter. There was no hurry. I walked for hours until the sun was high in the sky. I had strayed far enough from the cabin that I began to feel a twinge of unease. It wasn't anything specific, just an instinct. The woods were too still, too quiet. There were no sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just silence. I turned around and began the walk back, but the path I had taken didn't look the same. It was as if the trees had shifted, or the path had been swallowed by the forest. I stopped and looked around, but everything looked the same. Dense trees, thick underbrush, and the occasional boulder scattered across the ground. I wasn't lost, but the disorienting feeling lingered. I kept walking, pushing through the brush, trying to find a familiar landmark. Eventually, I spotted the clearing where the cabin should be, just up ahead. The sense of unease didn't fade, but I kept moving forward. I stepped back onto the porch, relieved to be home, if only for the moment. The evening was calm, but the strange feeling didn't leave. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I started another fire in the fireplace and settled in for a quiet night. The wind outside had died down completely, and for the first time since arriving, the woods felt unnaturally still. That night, I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black, and the air in the room felt heavy. At first, I couldn't figure out why I had woken up, but then I heard it. A faint sound, like something tapping against the window. It was soft, almost imperceptible. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the wind or some animal outside. But it continued, the tapping growing more insistent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and padded across the room to the window. I peered outside, but there was nothing. The porch was empty, and the trees were motionless. My heart was racing, but I tried to calm myself down. Maybe a branch had shifted in the wind and tapped against the glass. I returned to bed, pulling the covers tight around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tapping didn't come again that night, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw shadows moving outside the window, just beyond the trees. The next morning, I decided I needed to get out. The unease I had been feeling for days was building up, and I needed to clear my head. I packed up some supplies, grabbed a knife, and set off into the woods again. The sunlight was stronger today, but the air still had that strange heaviness to it. I walked further this time, pushing myself to go beyond the point where I had wandered yesterday. After a few hours, I stopped by a creek to drink some water. The sound of the rushing water was soothing, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since arriving. I sat on a rock and closed my eyes, just letting the quiet of the forest wash over me. But the feeling of being watched returned, creeping up my spine like an invisible presence. I stood quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. There, just past the trees, was something moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it was too fast, too erratic. The movement was unnatural, jerky, as if whatever it was wasn't used to being in the woods. I grabbed my knife and moved toward the edge of the forest, keeping my eyes trained on the movement. It was getting closer, but I couldn't make out any details. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I had to know what it was. As I reached the edge of the woods, I stopped dead in my tracks. There was nothing there. The forest was completely still, the air thick with silence. I looked around, confused and shaken, but all I saw were the same towering trees, their leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I turned and walked back to the cabin, faster now, as if something was following me. When I returned, I locked the door behind me. The silence outside was suffocating. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fire, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would clear my mind. But as I lay in bed, listening to the crackling of the fire, I heard it again, the faint tapping at the window. This time, I didn't get up. I didn't want to know what was out there. Instead, I pulled the blankets tighter around me and forced my eyes shut. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the woods. But deep down, I knew I wasn't alone. The tapping stopped, but I still didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed up my things and left. I didn't even bother to check the cabin before I left. The unease, the feeling of being watched, was too much. The woods had gotten inside my head, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else it had in store. As I drove away, the road seemed to stretch on forever, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the woods were watching me leave. The day I arrived at the cabin, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement mixed with anxiety. It was my first time staying in a secluded cabin in the middle of nowhere. My friends had always talked about it, the idea of getting away from the noise of the city, disconnecting from everything. and just being alone with nature. No phones, no distractions, just the wilderness and the small cabin that was meant to be our home for the next few days. The drive up had been long. The winding roads through thick forest felt like they would never end. But finally, I saw it. The little wooden cabin nestled among the trees, looking like it had been there for decades. The place wasn't exactly what I expected, though. I thought it would be cozy, rustic, the perfect hideaway. But instead, it looked old, worn, and a little bit run down. The wood was chipped and gray, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. The cabin sat alone, with no other buildings around, just a few overgrown trails leading into the thick forest. It didn't feel as welcoming as I had imagined, but I shrugged it off. I was here to get away from everything, to escape the world for a few days. I could deal with the cabin's quirks. I grabbed my duffel bag from the car and made my way up the creaky wooden steps to the front door. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It felt cooler here, the temperature dropping as the sun began to set behind the mountains. I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the place was dim, lit only by the weak light that seeped in through the grimy windows. A small living area greeted me, with a worn-out couch, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a coffee table cluttered with old magazines. The kitchen was tucked off to the side, small but functional, with a wood-burning stove and a fridge that hummed faintly. The bathroom was just down the hall, and the bedroom was upstairs, small but with a large window that overlooked the forest. I didn't have high expectations for comfort, but I was okay with that. The silence was what I craved, the peace that came with being so far removed from civilization. I spent the first few hours exploring the cabin, unpacking my things, and then just sitting by the window, watching the fading sunlight filter through the trees. The wind rustled the leaves, and the occasional bird call broke the silence, but otherwise, it was quiet, eerily quiet. As the darkness started to settle in, I lit a candle in the living room, not wanting to deal with the overhead lights. The flickering flame gave the room a soft, warm glow, and I sat there for a while, just listening to the sounds of the night. It was peaceful, but there was something about the silence that felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped further, and I decided it was time to get some sleep. I grabbed a blanket from the couch and made my way upstairs to the bedroom. The bed was simple, with an old quilt thrown over the top, but it looked comfortable enough. I pulled the quilt over myself and turned off the light, the room plunging into darkness. The wind outside was louder now, howling through the trees, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the wind, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The next day would be better, I thought. I would explore the trails, maybe do some fishing in the nearby stream. Everything would be fine, but sleep didn't come easily that night. I tossed and turned, the creaking of the cabin and the wind outside making it impossible to relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just outside the window, waiting for me to fall asleep. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the bedroom was ajar, just slightly, but it wasn't open when I had gone to bed. I sat up quickly, listening intently. The only sound was the wind outside, but I could swear I heard something else. A faint rustling, like someone was moving around downstairs. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe I had left a window open and the wind was causing something to move around. Maybe it was an animal, but I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my stomach. I slowly got out of bed, my feet cold on the wooden floor. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and quietly made my way downstairs, trying not to make any noise. The living room was empty, but the door to the kitchen was open, and I could see a faint light coming from the crack. My heart raced as I moved toward it, my breath shallow. I was sure I had closed that door when I went to bed. The kitchen was dark, but there was something strange about the air, damp, musty, like something had been disturbed. I pushed open the door, and the beam of my flashlight swept across the room. Nothing. No one was there. I let out a sigh of relief, but something still didn't sit right. I scanned the room again, looking for anything out of place. That's when I saw it. On the counter, there was a knife. It wasn't there before. I knew for a fact that I hadn't left it there, and there was no reason for it to be out in the open. I grabbed the knife quickly, my fingers tightening around the handle, and stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, my mind racing. Had someone been in here? I couldn't think of any logical explanation. There were no other cabins nearby, and the road was too far away for anyone to have snuck up without being seen. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt the need to leave, to get out of the cabin and back to the safety of the car. But I couldn't just leave, not like this. I spent the next few hours pacing, trying to make sense of what had happened. The knife stayed on the counter, a reminder of whatever had been here. Eventually, the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the cabin. The sounds of the night had faded, replaced by the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. I sat down by the window again, trying to calm my nerves. I told myself it was just a mistake, that I had left the knife out the night before and forgotten. But something in the pit of my stomach told me I was lying to myself. I didn't sleep that night, nor the next. Each creak, each rustle, each flicker of the candlelight made me jump, my mind unable to settle. But as the days passed, I started to find a rhythm. I explored the surrounding woods, walked the trails, and did my best to ignore the unease that lingered in the back of my mind. The cabin felt a little less eerie during the day, but when the sun set, the feeling would return, and I would be left alone with the silence, the shadows, and the cold. On the final day of my stay, I woke up to an odd sight. There was something outside the window, something I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was just the shadows of the trees, but as I focused, I could see it. A figure, standing still at the edge of the forest, barely visible in the growing light. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and rushed outside. The figure was gone. There was nothing in the clearing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I spent the rest of the morning packing my things, eager to leave. I didn't want to be here a minute longer. As I drove down the winding road, leaving the cabin behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every glance in the rearview mirror seemed to show something moving in the trees, something just out of sight. But when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. I drove faster, my pulse racing, until the road began to clear, and I could see the highway in the distance. Finally, I pulled over and took a deep breath, feeling the tension leave my body. The cabin was behind me now, and I had survived it. As I drove back into civilization, I couldn't help but feel like something in the forest had been watching me. But at least I was safe. At least I was leaving it all behind. I woke up to the sound of rain tapping lightly against the windows, a soft, rhythmic patter that seemed almost soothing in the middle of the night. I didn't have to look at the clock to know it was late. Everything felt heavy and still. It was one of those kinds of nights when the air outside feels like it's been soaked in moisture, and every breath you take carries the weight of the weather. I could hear the wind picking up too, rustling the trees outside in a way that sounded both natural and unnerving. I lay there for a while, trying to push the sleepiness back and force myself to be awake. There were so many things I should have done earlier in the day. The cabin was small, just one main room with a loft where the bed was, a kitchen nook below, and a tiny bathroom tucked off to the side. I had rented this place for the weekend, hoping to escape the noise of the city, to get away from the constant buzzing of phones, emails, and people. But now, here I was, alone in the dark, rain soaking into the ground, the only light coming from the thin sliver of moon peeking out from behind the clouds. I hadn't expected the isolation to hit so hard. The woods surrounding the cabin were dense, and the nearest neighbor was a good mile down the road. This place was remote, too remote maybe. I could feel it now, this crawling unease in my chest that hadn't been there before. I decided to get up. Maybe moving around would clear my head. As I swung my legs out of bed, the cold wood of the floor beneath my feet made me shiver. I grabbed a hoodie from the chair and pulled it on, the soft fabric doing little to fend off the chill that seemed to seep in from the walls themselves. I walked over to the small kitchen, the air in the room heavy with the smell of damp wood and earth. The rain had intensified, hammering the roof with a fury that made it feel as though the cabin was trapped in the center of a storm. I thought about making some coffee, but the thought of standing there waiting for the kettle to boil felt too much like a waste of time. Instead, I walked over to the window and looked outside. The rain blurred the glass, but I could make out the shapes of the trees swaying violently in the wind. The road that led up to the cabin was barely visible, swallowed by the thick undergrowth and the dark blur of rain. I shivered, pulling the curtains closed again. The weather was unsettling, but it was more than just that. I hadn't been able to shake the feeling since I first arrived here. This constant sense that something wasn't quite right. It was too quiet, too still. I shook my head and tried to push the thought away. Maybe I was just tired. I glanced at the fireplace, the small wood-burning stove sitting there like an old friend. It was cold, and I hadn't bothered to light it earlier, figuring the heat from the space heater would be enough. I thought about making a fire, but then I heard it. A faint noise, something scraping against the wall. I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. I couldn't say what it was at first. It wasn't a sound you could easily place. It wasn't the wind or the rain or anything natural. It was too deliberate, too precise, like someone or something was pushing against the side of the cabin. My heart started to pound in my chest, and for a moment, I stood frozen, just listening. The sound stopped, then started again. Faint, but distinct. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't just stand there. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer by the kitchen, my hands shaking slightly as I turned it on. I moved cautiously toward the front door. The noise stopped, and for a brief second, I thought maybe I was overreacting. It had to be the wind or an animal. It wasn't possible that someone would be out here. No one could get to the cabin without a long walk or a very bumpy ride. I opened the door just a crack, peering out into the storm. The wind was so strong it nearly yanked the door out of my hands. The porch was empty, nothing but the dark blur of trees and rain. But there was something off about the silence. The rain, the wind, the trees all seemed to pause for just a second. It was as if they were holding their breath. I stepped outside, my boots slipping slightly on the wet wood of the porch. I shone the flashlight out toward the edge of the woods, but the beam only cut through a few feet of the night before disappearing into the shadows. There was no sign of anything or anyone. I told myself I was being paranoid. It was probably just a branch rubbing against the cabin in the wind. It had to be. I stepped back inside and closed the door with a thud, feeling the weight of the air settle back into place. My pulse was still racing, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to lie back down or if I needed to investigate further. I debated going out to check the perimeter of the cabin, but it was cold, and the storm was relentless. The wind howled outside, as though mocking my decision to step out there at all. I walked back into the kitchen and turned on the kettle. The noise of the water filling the pot was oddly comforting in the otherwise tense silence. The storm, however, seemed to be getting worse. I could feel the tension in the air, the kind that presses against your skin, like it's about to crack open and change everything. The storm wasn't just rain anymore. It was the force of something much bigger, something primal. Then there was the noise again, a louder scrape, this time more forceful, more insistent. It sounded like it was coming from the back of the cabin. I couldn't ignore it this time. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt the blood rush to my ears. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hand trembling as I clicked it on, and rushed toward the back door. I flung it open without thinking, the wind almost knocking it back in my face. There was nothing there, nothing but the thick, dark wall of trees, the wild motion of the storm. The rain beat against the ground, the wind howled, and the trees swayed violently. But then I saw it, a figure. It was standing just beyond the tree line, still as a statue. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to breathe, didn't even react to the storm around it. It was only the shape of a person standing still, watching, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or even if it was human. The figure was too far away, obscured by the darkness of the woods and the whipping rain. But the unmistakable feeling of being watched washed over me in waves. A shiver ran through me. I knew I had to go inside. The moment I stepped back into the cabin, I bolted the door shut. I checked the windows, all the locks. I moved quickly through the house, checking every corner, every door, every window. Nothing, no sign of anyone. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to keep my mind from wandering. Every crackle from the wood seemed like a knock at the door. Every gust of wind seemed like someone trying to break in. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, wide-eyed, waiting for something I couldn't explain. By morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was still quiet. The wind had died down, and the rain had turned into a gentle mist that hung in the air. The cabin, for all its eeriness the night before, now looked peaceful, like it had always been that way. I decided to leave. There was something in the woods that didn't sit right, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't stay there another night. As I loaded up my car, ready to head back home, I saw something in the dirt near the edge of the cabin. A footprint. It was fresh. I got in my car, slammed the door shut, and drove off without looking back. The cabin stood at the edge of the woods, nestled between towering pines that whispered in the wind. It was a small, weather-beaten place, looking as though it had been forgotten by time. The wood was gray from years of exposure to the elements, the roof slightly slanted, covered with a layer of moss that had grown thick over the years. It wasn't much, but it was exactly what I was looking for. I needed a break from everything, the noise, the constant rush, the endless distractions. A weekend to disconnect, to be alone, to think. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky tinged with orange and purple as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that felt sharp against your skin but wasn't unbearable. The ground was soft underfoot, with fallen needles and leaves making a thick carpet. The cabin was remote, far from the nearest town. Perfect spot to escape to. There was no one around, no neighbors, no cabins nearby, just the stillness of the woods and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or bird overhead. I unloaded my car and grabbed my bag, heading toward the cabin. It creaked as I opened the door, the hinges groaning as though protesting the disturbance after years of silence. The smell of old wood and dust hit me. Inside, the air was musty, but not unpleasant. The space was small, with a single room, a fireplace on one side, and a few pieces of old furniture that looked like they hadn't been touched in ages. I could already tell that the place hadn't seen much use. The floorboards were uneven, and there was a noticeable draft. But I didn't mind. It added to the charm. I set my things down on the couch, which had seen better days but still seemed serviceable enough. There was a small kitchen area off to one side with an old stove and a sink that had likely never been updated. It was perfect. I had everything I needed. I threw my coat over the back of the chair, lit a fire in the fireplace, and unpacked my bag. The night fell quickly, the temperature dropping as the darkness enveloped the cabin. I could hear the wind picking up outside, shaking the branches of the trees, and the occasional thud of something heavy dropping to the ground. I spent the evening reading, a book I had meant to finish for months but never found the time to. It felt good to just be alone, to be in a place where the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. It was peaceful, too peaceful. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. The fire was burning low, so I banked it with some more wood before heading to bed. The bed wasn't much, just a mattress on a frame, but it was comfortable enough. The blankets were warm, and I soon found myself drifting off to sleep. But then I woke up. It was the sound that got to me first. It was faint, at first, almost like a scratching. It was coming from the far corner of the cabin, near the window. My eyes snapped open and I lay still, listening. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get in. My breath hitched in my throat. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten into the cabin. But as I lay there, listening to the sound, I started to feel a creeping unease. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded too purposeful. I quietly got out of bed, careful not to make a sound. The scratching continued, and I could now hear a low thudding noise, as if something was pushing against the walls. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly approached the window. The scratching stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind or an animal outside or the house settling. I reached the window and pulled back the curtain, shining the flashlight outside. There was nothing. The night was still, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but nothing that could explain the noise. I exhaled in relief and took a step back, feeling foolish for getting so worked up over nothing. But just as I was about to turn back to the bed, I heard it again. A sharp, desperate scratching, this time louder, more frantic. It came from the corner of the cabin, near the door. My blood ran cold. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I slowly turned to face the door. The wind outside howled louder, but this time, there was something else. The scratching was accompanied by a soft thudding, as if something was trying to get inside. I was certain now that it wasn't just an animal. It felt wrong. The sound was too human, too intentional. I didn't want to check, but I knew I had to. I moved to the door, my pulse racing, and slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, and I stepped out onto the small porch. The air was colder than before, the wind biting at my skin. I scanned the area around the cabin, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was nothing there. The woods were silent, still, too still. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees, the wind, the quiet. I felt foolish, standing there in the cold night air, half expecting to see something out of the corner of my eye. I went back inside and locked the door behind me, feeling a little ridiculous for getting so worked up. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't hear the scratching again, and the wind died down. By morning, the fear that had settled in my chest had faded somewhat. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Just the wind, maybe some animals. The cabin was old, and it made strange noises. I wasn't used to the isolation. That was all. I spent the next day cleaning up around the cabin, chopping some firewood, and taking a walk in the woods. The sun was out, and it was a perfect fall day. The kind of day where everything feels peaceful and quiet. I had almost forgotten about the strange sounds from the night before. That night, though, as I settled back into bed, I heard it again. This time, the scratching was louder, closer, like it was right outside the cabin. My heart skipped a beat, and I lay still, listening. There was something different this time, something more urgent. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breathing shallow. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. I got up, my hands trembling as I grabbed the flashlight. I shone it through the cabin, scanning the room. The scratching stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought maybe it was my imagination. But then I heard it again, even closer this time. I jumped at the sound, my flashlight shaking in my hand. It was coming from the door again. My mind raced. Was someone outside? Someone trying to break in? No, that didn't make sense. I was miles from the nearest road. Who would be out here? I crept to the door, heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened it just a crack. The cold night air rushed in, and I peered into the darkness. There was nothing there, just the trees, the night, the silence. I quickly shut the door again, but the feeling of unease only grew. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave. The next morning, I packed my things, double-checked that I hadn't left anything behind, and made sure the cabin was locked up. As I pulled away from the cabin, heading back down the narrow dirt road, I glanced back over my shoulder. The cabin stood there, silent, empty. I wasn't sure what I had experienced those 2 nights. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation, the weird noises of an old cabin. Maybe it was all in my head. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Something had been trying to get in. And no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I knew I would never go back to that cabin again. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Something was off, and I had no intention of finding out what it was. The wind howled through the trees as I walked down the narrow, dirt path. The dark sky overhead hinted at a storm, but I wasn't concerned. I had walked this path countless times before, though tonight felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I pushed it aside, focusing on the task ahead, getting to the cabin before nightfall. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, hoping for some peace and quiet to clear my head. The city was suffocating, and I needed to disconnect from everything. No phone, no internet, just the quiet of the woods. The perfect escape. At least that's what I thought. The cabin was located a few miles off the main road, deep in the forest. I had been here once before, a year ago, and it had been a great getaway. The owner, a quiet man who didn't speak much, had made it clear that the place was old but well maintained. The cabin was simple. A small one-room building with a stone fireplace, a few windows, and basic furniture. No luxuries, but that was fine with me. I didn't need much. As I got closer, I noticed the trees seemed denser than I remembered. They were thicker, darker, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally in the dimming light. A chill crept up my spine, but I told myself it was just the wind picking up, causing the branches to sway in strange patterns. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. When I finally reached the cabin, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. I stopped in my tracks. I was sure I had locked it before leaving last time. I was always careful about things like that. I approached slowly, hesitant, but there didn't seem to be anyone around. Maybe I had just imagined it. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The familiar smell of pine and wood hit me immediately, but something else lingered in the air. Something faint, almost metallic, like rust. I frowned and glanced around. The cabin was just as I remembered it, but there was something off. The furniture was a little more worn. The floorboards creaked in places they didn't before. The fire pit had not been used in some time. I shrugged it off. Old cabins like these naturally showed signs of wear and tear. I locked the door behind me and set down my bag. My phone had no service, but that was to be expected out here. I took a deep breath and tried to relax. The sun was starting to set, so I made a fire in the hearth, using the dry wood stacked neatly in the corner. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. I unpacked a few things, settled into the small wooden chair by the fire, and just let the heat wash over me. The storm was getting closer, the wind picking up outside. It was quiet in here, the kind of quiet that felt thick, almost oppressive. I shifted in my chair, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me. The storm outside was likely making everything feel more intense. As the evening wore on, the storm grew louder, and the wind howled through the trees. The rain came down in sheets, beating against the roof and windows. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, staring into the fire. I tried to read, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the strange feeling I couldn't shake. It was as if I was being watched, though I was alone in the cabin. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps outside, faint but unmistakable. They weren't regular. They were uneven, like someone was stumbling through the woods. I stood up, heart racing, and went to the window. I peered out into the darkness, but I saw nothing. Just the rain, the trees swaying in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was the storm messing with my senses. But the feeling of unease grew. I checked the door again, ensuring it was locked. I didn't know why, but I felt safer knowing it was. The hours passed slowly, and eventually I gave up on reading. I lay down on the small cot, the covers pulled up to my chin. The fire had long since died down, and the only sound now was the relentless rain and the wind battering the cabin. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, kept me on edge. I must have dozed off eventually, but the strange noise outside woke me up a few hours later. It was subtle at first, just a soft scraping sound, like something was being dragged along the ground. I lay still, my heart pounding. The sound stopped. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but it didn't feel like that. The wind had a rhythm to it, a pattern, but this was different. It was deliberate. I listened closely, straining to hear. The scraping sound resumed, this time louder, closer. My mind raced. Was someone out there? Was there another cabin nearby? I knew the area was remote, but I had heard rumors of people living further down the trail, though I had never seen anyone. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and cautiously made my way to the door. The scraping continued, growing louder, but still no voices, no sign of life. I unlocked the door quietly, making sure it didn't creak. I stepped outside, holding the flashlight in front of me. The storm had intensified, the rain falling harder now, but the darkness outside was thick. I couldn't see far beyond the small patch of light from my flashlight. I strained my ears, trying to locate the source of the noise. It was coming from the far side of the cabin, beyond the tree line. The sound of something dragging, like it was being pulled slowly through the mud. I stood there, frozen, the beam of light shaking in my hands. The noise stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence filled the air. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. After a few moments, I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. I couldn't explain it. It was just too strange. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably some animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer, but something told me it wasn't. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. In fact, it had grown stronger, more pressing. I couldn't shake the thought that there was someone else out here with me. The storm raged on, and I finally decided to try and sleep. I didn't know how long I stayed awake, but the hours passed slowly, each minute dragging on like an eternity. The rain continued to pour down, the wind howling like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my body tense, my mind racing. Suddenly, there was a loud bang against the side of the cabin. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bolted upright. The noise was followed by another, then another, like something heavy was being thrown against the wall. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking, and slowly got to my feet. The banging continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was trying to break through. Panic surged through me. What was happening? Who was out there? I moved to the window, my heart pounding. I didn't dare open the door again. Through the rain and the darkness, I saw nothing. No figures, no movement, just the trees swaying violently in the storm. But the banging was still there, echoing through the cabin, coming from the far side again. I backed away from the window, my mind spinning. The room was too quiet now, too still. The storm outside wasn't just loud, it was isolating. It felt like the world had closed in around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. I waited, tense, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening. I didn't know how much time passed, but eventually, I heard a sound again, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, slow, uneven steps like someone dragging their feet through the mud. But they weren't outside this time. They were coming from inside the cabin. I froze, my blood running cold. The footsteps came closer, each one a slow, deliberate step. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. I turned toward the door, knowing there was no way out. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath, and then, just as quickly as they had started, they began again, this time moving away from me, toward the other side of the room. I stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like hours, my mind racing. My eyes never left the door, my body tense, waiting for the next move. The footsteps finally stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. It wasn't until the next morning that I dared leave the cabin. The storm had passed, the sun shining weakly through the clouds. The woods were quiet, peaceful even. I checked the outside of the cabin carefully, but there was no sign of any disturbance. Nothing had changed. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. As I packed my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I wasn't sure what had happened during the night, but I knew one thing for certain. Something or someone had been watching me. I didn't stay another night. The drive back to the city felt too long, the road stretching endlessly before. It was one of those last-minute trips, the kind where you don't really have everything planned out and you're just throwing stuff in a bag, hoping you don't forget anything important. I'd been itching to get away for a few days, and a cabin I found online seemed perfect. Isolated, cheap, and exactly the kind of place I needed to escape to. The description on the website made it sound like a charming little cabin, tucked away in the woods. It wasn't too far from the nearest town, but it was far enough to make me feel like I was in the middle of nowhere. I packed my car with camping gear, a few snacks, and some warm clothes. The weather had been a bit unpredictable lately, and I didn't want to risk being caught out in the cold. The drive to the cabin was longer than I had expected, but that wasn't a problem. It gave me time to listen to the quiet hum of the road beneath me and think about nothing in particular. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, and the sky was a mix of deep oranges and pinks. The cabin itself was small, like the kind you'd expect to see in a postcard. It was made of dark wood with a small porch and a large window that overlooked a small clearing surrounded by tall, dense trees. The cabin was exactly what I needed. Simple. No frills, just a place to rest and be alone. I pulled up to the front of the cabin and unpacked my things. The key was under the mat, just like the instructions had said. Inside, it was cozy, but sparse. There was a fireplace, a few old chairs, a table, and a small kitchen area with basic supplies. The bathroom was just off the kitchen, and there was a small loft upstairs that held a bed. It looked like it hadn't been used much, but it smelled faintly of wood and dust. It wasn't a bad smell, though kind of comforting in a way. I started a fire in the fireplace to warm the place up a little, unpacked some of my food, and settled in for the evening. The quietness of the place was almost overwhelming. There was no sound except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind outside. I spent the night in front of the fire, reading and listening to the sounds of nature creeping in from the woods around me. The isolation wasn't uncomfortable at first, but as the night deepened, I started to feel a little uneasy. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It was just a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was the way the trees seemed to sway in the wind, or how the cabin creaked every time the temperature dropped a little more. Whatever it was, I tried to ignore it. The fire kept me warm, and soon enough, I was drifting off to sleep in the loft. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't loud, more of a soft tapping sound, almost like someone was gently knocking on the door. I stayed still, listening for a moment, trying to figure out if I had just imagined it. The wind had picked up, and it was possible that it was just a branch hitting the cabin. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The tapping came again, softer this time, like it was coming from the window. I was sure now that something was out there. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably an animal, maybe a squirrel or something, trying to get inside. But the rest of me felt uneasy, like I shouldn't go anywhere near the window. I got out of bed and slowly made my way down the stairs, my bare feet brushing against the cold floorboards. The tapping stopped as I reached the bottom of the stairs, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But when I turned the corner to the window, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, in the moonlight, standing just beyond the window, was a figure. It was hard to make out any details at first because of the darkness outside, but I could tell that it was tall and thin, and its head seemed to be tilted unnaturally to the side. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It was like it was waiting for me to do something. Couldn't help it. My hand reached for the handle of the door, and before I knew what I was doing, I was outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't care. I had to see what was out there. The figure hadn't moved, and as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. It was a tree, or at least it looked like a tree at first. The thing in front of me was tall and thin, but it had long, spindly branches that were moving in the wind. The more I looked at it, the more I realized how strange it was. It wasn't a normal tree, but something about it felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the branches twisted in unnatural ways, almost like they were reaching for me. I turned and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. I felt a knot of panic rising in my chest. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight and looked out the window again. The figure was gone. I told myself it had just been my imagination playing tricks on me. The wind had been strong, and I had probably misinterpreted the movement of the branches. But the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, not even bothering to make coffee. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I just wanted to get out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was still there, standing alone in the clearing. It looked peaceful in the early morning light, but I knew better now. The woods had a way of hiding things, of making you feel like you were alone when you weren't. It was a long drive back, and the further I got from that place, the more I started to feel like I could breathe again. The strange, unsettling feeling began to fade, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure, about what it really was, and about how, even though I had left, it felt like the woods were still watching me. By the time I made it back home, I felt safe, but I couldn't shake the image of that twisted figure out of my mind. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I'd never be going back to that cabin. The woods had a way of hiding things, and some things were better left undisturbed.